The past is not silent. It is waiting to be read. In buried settlements, weathered monuments, sealed tombs, and scattered fragments, archaeology continues to reveal evidence that can overturn long-held assumptions. Some discoveries demonstrate remarkable ingenuity, while others leave historians confronting gaps no artifact can fully explain. Tonight, we enter that uncertain territory, following the evidence wherever it leads. High above the dry ravines of the Judean desert, a small cave opens into the rock, its narrow interior once preserving objects from a world nearly 9,000 years distant. At Nahal, Hemar, archaeologists uncovered human skulls treated with a dark organic substance and decorated in delicate net-like patterns, alongside stone masks, figurines, woven materials, baskets, and tools. Scientific analysis has identified resin and animal-derived compounds within the coating, revealing deliberate preparation rather than accidental staining. The setting itself is significant. Nahal Hemar was occupied during the pre-pottery Neolithic B period, a time when communities across the southern Levant were developing increasingly elaborate relationships with the dead. At several settlements, human skulls were removed from burials, cleaned, and sometimes reconstructed with plaster. Faces could be remodeled, eyes represented with shells, and the finished skulls apparently given a new social or symbolic identity. But the skulls from Nahal Hemar were different. Rather than being covered in the pale plaster familiar from sites farther north, several were coated with a brown-black substance. On the surface, lines crossed one another to form a geometric net, producing an appearance unlike ordinary funerary treatment. Researchers have identified compounds consistent with plant resin, while earlier studies connected the material with collagen and bitumen-like substances. The direct dating of the coating places it around 8,920 to 8,430 BC, making the treatment remarkably early. Why would a community remove a person's head, preserve the skull, and then transform its appearance? The most widely accepted interpretation places these objects within Neolithic ancestor-related ritual practices. The skull may have ceased to represent only a deceased individual, and instead become a symbolic presence within the community. Similar practices occurred at other settlements, suggesting that the treatment of human remains was part of a broader cultural tradition rather than an isolated experiment. Yet the exact meaning remains beyond our reach. No written explanation survives. There is no inscription telling us whose skulls these were, who handled them, or what ceremonies surrounded them. The cave itself adds another layer of uncertainty. Its exceptionally dry conditions preserved organic materials rarely found in prehistoric settlements. Fragments of baskets, linen, wooden objects, cords, beads, and other implements. Some researchers have interpreted the assemblage as evidence for ritual activity, while others have proposed that the cave may have functioned partly as a storage place for objects associated with ceremonies. Recent research has even questioned whether every flint artifact should automatically be regarded as ritual equipment, reminding us that the boundary between ceremonial and everyday activity may not have been so clear. Then, there is the possibility that the skulls served more than one purpose. Perhaps they represented particular ancestors. Perhaps they were displayed during gatherings, carried during ceremonies, or preserved as tangible links between generations. Some researchers have suggested that the net-like decoration may have evoked a headdress, hinting at a visual transformation rather than simple preservation. But these interpretations remain reconstructions, built from fragments of material evidence rather than direct testimony. More speculative interpretations have sometimes treated the skulls as evidence of a highly organized death cult or an elaborate system of ceremonial authority. Such possibilities cannot be demonstrated from the archaeological record alone, yet neither can the deeper symbolism be reduced to a single explanation. The people of Nahal Hemar left no written account of what these objects meant. They left only the materials themselves: bone, resin, stone, fiber, and carefully arranged traces of human intention. And after nearly 9,000 years, those traces still preserve a question that archaeology can approach, but perhaps never completely answer. Who were these skulls meant to become after death? And what role did they play in the living world that preserved them? From the dry, windswept coast of northern Chile, we move from the carefully transformed skulls of Nahal Hemar to another remarkable expression of prehistoric ritual. Here, along one of the driest landscapes on Earth, the Chinchorro people left behind wooden figures whose quiet forms offer an unusual glimpse into how early coastal communities may have understood death, identity, and the presence of those who had come before. The figures are modest in scale. Carved from wood, sometimes fashioned with simple bodies and recognizable human proportions, they lack the monumental character associated with later sculpture. Yet, their simplicity is precisely what makes them compelling. These were objects created by communities living thousands of years ago, long before writing, cities, or formal states existed in the region. The Chinchorro occupied portions of the Pacific coast of present-day northern Chile and southern Peru from roughly 7,000 BC onward. They were highly skilled maritime foragers, depending heavily on fish, shellfish, and other resources from the ocean. Their settlements were often temporary or semi-sedentary, yet their treatment of the dead could be remarkably elaborate. That contrast is important. The people who produced these wooden objects were not simply preserving bodies because they lacked other ways to dispose of them. Chinchorro mortuary traditions could involve deliberate removal of organs, drying or reconstruction of the body, application of clay and pigments, and careful reshaping of the deceased. Some mummies were covered with black or red pigments, while others received masks and artificial hair. Against this background, wooden figures take on a different significance. Could they have represented individuals connected with particular ceremonies? Were they companions for the dead, symbolic bodies, or representations of ancestors? Archaeologists must approach such questions cautiously, because the objects themselves rarely provide a definitive explanation. The archaeological record does, however, establish that the Chinchorro placed extraordinary attention on the relationship between the living and the dead. Their mortuary practices continued and changed over thousands of years, suggesting that beliefs surrounding death were not fixed. They evolved alongside changing communities and environments. Some interpretations therefore place wooden figures within this broader ceremonial world. A carved human form may have provided a physical representation when the actual body could no longer serve that purpose. In this view, the figure was not necessarily a portrait in the modern sense. It may instead have expressed identity, social memory, or a connection between a deceased person and the community. But the evidence leaves room for other possibilities. Perhaps these objects participated in rituals that archaeologists can no longer reconstruct. They might have been displayed temporarily, carried during gatherings, positioned near burials, or used in ceremonies whose meaning depended on gestures, spoken words, and beliefs that left no physical trace. Even their apparent simplicity can be misleading. A wooden figure requires decisions about shape, posture, proportions, and surface treatment. Someone selected the material, carved it, and decided where and when it should be used. Yet, without the surrounding ritual context, much of that process remains invisible. More speculative interpretations sometimes extend the role of such figures toward ancestor representation or ritual intermediaries. There is no secure evidence that they were regarded as supernatural beings, and archaeology cannot establish precisely what the Chinchorro believed about them. Still, the possibility that these objects embodied relationships between the living and the dead remains difficult to dismiss. What makes the subject particularly compelling is the extraordinary antiquity of the cultural tradition surrounding them. These objects belong to a world in which human communities were already developing complex ways to remember, transform, and represent their dead. The dry, coastal environment has preserved fragments that might otherwise have disappeared completely. But preservation does not guarantee understanding. We can see the carved wood, the form of the figures, and their archaeological surroundings. What remains inaccessible is the moment when they mattered most. The ceremony, the words, the emotions, and the beliefs that gave them meaning. And so, beside the Pacific coast, these quiet wooden forms continue to raise an unresolved question. Were they simply representations of people who had died, or did they occupy a more important place within the Chinchorro relationship with the dead, one whose full meaning still lies beyond the surviving evidence? From the coastal communities of the Chinchorro, our journey moves northward and forward in time, toward the shores of the Black Sea, where another prehistoric discovery reveals an extraordinary relationship between wealth, identity, and death. In a landscape near modern-day Varna, Bulgaria, archaeologists uncovered one of the most remarkable Copper Age burial complexes ever excavated. Beneath layers of soil lay graves containing thousands of artifacts, gold ornaments, copper objects, flint tools, beads, pottery, and carefully arranged human remains. Yet, among the richest discoveries were burials in which no complete human body was present at all. These were cenotaphs. The term describes symbolic graves constructed without the physical remains of the person they commemorated. At Varna, several such installations contained carefully arranged objects, including remarkable quantities of gold, sometimes accompanied by symbolic representations of the human body. The cemetery itself dates mainly to the 5th millennium BC, roughly 6,000 years ago. Its inhabitants belonged to a sophisticated Copper Age society that occupied a region where farming, fishing, craftsmanship, and long-distance exchange were developing rapidly. Then came the gold. The sheer quantity recovered from the cemetery is extraordinary for such an early period. Thousands of gold objects were excavated, including beads, bracelets, appliques, rings, and other ornaments. Some graves contained relatively modest possessions, while others were equipped with an astonishing concentration of valuable materials. One burial, often identified as Grave 43, contained an exceptionally large collection of gold objects alongside copper tools, flint artifacts, and other possessions. The individual appears to have been treated differently from most people buried at the cemetery. But the cenotaphs complicate the picture. In some graves, archaeologists found no complete skeleton. Instead, objects were arranged as though representing a person who was not physically present. Gold ornaments could be positioned where parts of the body might normally have been placed, creating a symbolic human presence without an actual corpse. Why would a community construct a grave for someone whose body was absent? The most conventional explanation is that these were memorial burials. Perhaps the deceased had died far from home, their remains had been lost, or circumstances prevented the body from being recovered. A symbolic burial could have allowed the community to perform the social and ritual duties associated with death despite the absence of the individual. But another possibility lies within the arrangement itself. Some cenotaphs contain objects deliberately positioned to suggest human anatomy. Could this have been a symbolic reconstruction of an absent person? Were the objects meant to represent status, identity, or qualities associated with the deceased? The evidence cannot provide a definitive answer. Varna also presents a broader question about the emergence of social inequality. The dramatic differences between graves suggest that wealth and status were not distributed evenly within this society. Some individuals received elaborate collections of precious materials, while others were buried with comparatively few possessions. Was this evidence of hereditary rank, religious authority, specialized leadership, or simply exceptional individuals whose importance emerged from particular circumstances? Archaeologists have proposed several interpretations, but none completely explains the cemetery. The gold itself may have carried meanings beyond material value. It required skilled craftsmanship, access to raw materials, and considerable labor. Its presence in graves could have expressed social position, ritual importance, or membership within a particular community. The cenotaphs introduce an even deeper uncertainty. If the absent bodies represented people who could not return, the graves may preserve stories of death far from home. If they represented symbolic individuals, they may reveal a sophisticated understanding of identity in which a person could be commemorated through objects rather than physical remains. More speculative interpretations have suggested that some burials may have belonged to rulers, priests, or figures whose authority extended beyond ordinary social roles. Yet, the archaeological evidence does not allow us to assign such titles with confidence. What remains is the cemetery itself. Thousands of objects, carefully positioned bodies, empty graves, and gold that survived for 6 millennia beneath the earth. The people of Varna left no written explanation for the graves they created. We can reconstruct their craftsmanship, exchange networks, burial practices, and social differences, but the meaning behind the empty graves remains uncertain. Perhaps these cenotaphs commemorated people whose bodies never returned. Perhaps they represented identities preserved through objects rather than flesh. Or perhaps their purpose belonged to a ritual language that disappeared along with the people who spoke it. And as the evidence becomes more precise, one question remains. When the body was absent, what exactly did the people of Varna believe they were burying? From the empty graves of Varna, our journey moves westward, toward the narrow gorge of the Danube, where a settlement once stood against the river more than 7,000 years ago. At Lepenski Vir, among the remains of carefully planned dwellings and burials, archaeologists uncovered something far more difficult to interpret. Small stone sculptures with human faces, unlike any other known prehistoric art of the region. Their surfaces are weathered, but their features remain remarkably expressive. Some have elongated heads, deep-set eyes, pronounced noses, and broad mouths carved directly into rounded river stones. Others combine human characteristics with forms that seem almost aquatic or animal-like. They do not resemble naturalistic portraits. Instead, each sculpture appears deliberately constructed, as though the artist was attempting to represent something more than an ordinary human face. Lepenski Vir lies along the Danube in present-day Serbia, within the Iron Gates Gorge, a dramatic landscape where steep cliffs and powerful currents once shaped the lives of prehistoric communities. The settlement developed during the Mesolithic and early Neolithic periods, roughly from the 7th to the 6th millennium BC. Its inhabitants were closely connected to the river. Fishing was central to their economy, and archaeological evidence shows that aquatic resources played an important role in daily life. The Danube provided food, transportation, and a landscape filled with symbolic possibilities. For people living beside such a powerful natural feature, the river may have been more than a source of nourishment. Then there are the sculptures. Often called the Lepenski Vir sculptures, these works were carved from sandstone or other local stone and placed within houses, around hearths, or in other significant locations. Their exact function remains uncertain. Some appear to have been deliberately positioned in relation to domestic spaces, suggesting that they may have played a role in household rituals or communal activities. But what did they represent? The most widely accepted interpretations connect them with religious or symbolic beliefs associated with the river and the natural environment. Their unusual facial features may have expressed supernatural beings, ancestors, or a conceptual relationship between humans and aquatic forces. Several sculptures have features that seem unmistakably human, yet their mouths, eyes, and proportions give them an otherworldly appearance. Some seem almost fish-like. This has encouraged interpretations linking them to river spirits or mythological beings. Such ideas are plausible, but they remain interpretations. There is no written language from Lepenski Vir explaining the sculptures. No surviving inscription identifies their names or purpose. Their meaning must therefore be reconstructed from placement, style, surrounding artifacts, and comparison with other prehistoric traditions. The architecture adds another layer. Many dwellings at the settlement have distinctive trapezoidal floor plans, with carefully constructed hearths positioned near their centers. Burials occurred both within and around domestic spaces, suggesting that the boundary between household, community, and ritual activity may have been less rigid than it is today. Perhaps the sculptures belong to this same integrated world. A carved face might have represented an ancestor remembered within a household. It could have embodied a protective presence associated with the river. Or it may have served as a ritual object used during ceremonies whose meaning depended on gestures and spoken traditions that have disappeared completely. More speculative interpretations sometimes portray the sculptures as evidence of a sophisticated prehistoric religion centered on aquatic beings or a distinct priestly class. There is little evidence to establish such claims with certainty, yet the unusual consistency of the sculptures suggests that their creation was not random. Why did several artists choose such distinctive facial forms? Were they attempting to depict real people, or were they giving physical form to beings that existed only within the community's belief system? Did the exaggerated features carry symbolic meanings that would have been immediately understood by everyone who lived there? Even their placement raises questions. Objects placed inside houses could have been part of everyday life, ritual practice, or both. Perhaps the distinction itself would have made little sense to the people who used them. Today, the stone faces of Lepenski Vir remain silent. Their eyes cannot tell us what they witnessed, and their carved mouths preserve no words. Yet, they remain among the most evocative artistic expressions of prehistoric southeastern Europe, linking human creativity with a landscape dominated by water, stone, and powerful seasonal rhythms. And somewhere between portrait and symbol, ancestor and spirit, the true identity of these carved faces remains uncertain. Were they representations of people, embodiments of unseen forces, or something that belonged to a category of belief we no longer possess the language to understand? From the carved stone faces of Lepenski Vir, our journey moves farther north into the fertile lowlands of Central Europe, where another prehistoric settlement preserves a far more unsettling archaeological puzzle. At Vráble, in present-day Slovakia, excavators uncovered human remains that reveal deliberate manipulation of the dead. Bodies placed in unusual positions, skulls separated from skeletons, and graves that seem to record acts performed long after ordinary burial. The settlement belongs to the linear pottery culture, or LBK, which spread across much of Central Europe during the 6th millennium BC. These communities were among the earliest farming societies in the region, establishing permanent settlements, cultivating crops, raising animals, and building substantial houses. At first glance, Vráble appears to fit this familiar pattern. But the cemetery tells another story. Archaeological investigations at Vráble revealed numerous burials, including individuals whose heads had been deliberately removed. In some cases, skulls were deposited separately, while other remains appear to have been disturbed after the initial burial. The arrangement suggests that these were not simply the result of natural decomposition or accidental damage. The question is why? Removing a person's head requires deliberate action. It demands physical effort, but perhaps more importantly, it requires a cultural reason. Was the deceased being punished, protected, commemorated, or transformed into something with a new role within the community? Researchers have considered several possibilities. One explanation connects the decapitations with beliefs surrounding death and the potentially dangerous condition of the recently deceased. In many societies, human communities have developed rituals intended to prevent the dead from returning, whether literally or symbolically. A body might be restrained, weighted down, repositioned, or otherwise altered. But there is another possibility. The removal of the head may have been connected with ancestor practices. If the skull was regarded as the most important physical representation of a person, separating it from the body could have allowed the community to retain or manipulate a powerful symbol of identity. This interpretation becomes particularly interesting when viewed alongside broader Neolithic traditions. Across parts of southeastern and central Europe, human remains were sometimes revisited long after burial. Bones could be moved, rearranged, collected, or incorporated into later ritual activity. Death was not necessarily treated as a single event. It could represent a process extending over months, years, or generations. At Vráble, however, the evidence is difficult to interpret with certainty. Were all of the decapitated individuals treated according to the same ritual rules? Did their social identities differ from those of other members of the settlement? Were the heads removed immediately after death, or only after the body had decomposed? Each possibility would suggest a different understanding of the ceremony. Some more speculative interpretations have suggested that particular individuals may have been victims of ritual violence or acts intended to eliminate perceived threats. Others have proposed that the skulls themselves may have been curated because they were believed to retain an individual's essence, authority, or memory. There is no simple archaeological marker that can settle the question. The wider context of Vráble makes the discovery even more significant. The settlement appears to have experienced periods of social tension, demographic change, and eventual abandonment. Archaeologists are examining whether unusual burials reflect broader transformations within the community, including changing attitudes toward outsiders, violence, and social boundaries. Yet caution remains essential. A decapitated skeleton does not automatically represent sacrifice, execution, or warfare. Archaeology must distinguish between evidence and interpretation. The physical remains tell us that bodies were manipulated. They do not, by themselves, tell us what those actions meant. Perhaps the head was feared. Perhaps it was revered. Perhaps the person had acquired an identity in death that required a completely different treatment from ordinary members of the community. And as researchers continue to examine the graves, one question remains particularly difficult to answer. When the people of Vráble separated the head from the body, were they attempting to erase a person's presence, preserve it, or transform it into something the living could continue to control? From the carefully separated remains at Vráble, our journey moves southward toward another Neolithic site, where the evidence is even more difficult to reconcile with an ordinary burial. Near the village of Potočani in eastern Croatia, beneath what initially appeared to be an unremarkable patch of soil, archaeologists uncovered a mass grave containing the remains of dozens of people who died around 6,200 years ago. There was no monumental tomb. No elaborate architecture marked the location. Instead, the evidence emerged from a shallow burial containing the remains of at least 41 individuals, including men, women, and children. Their bones tell a disturbing story. Anthropological examination revealed numerous injuries consistent with violent trauma. Several individuals had wounds to the skull, while other skeletal remains showed evidence of blows inflicted around the time of death. The injuries were not restricted to one age group or sex. This is important. The people buried at Potočani were not simply a group of warriors killed in a conventional battle. children, and adults were among the dead, and the archaeological pattern suggests that violence reached across the community. The burial dates to the Copper Age, around 4200 BC, when agricultural societies in southeastern Europe were undergoing significant social and demographic changes. Communities were becoming more established, resources were increasingly important, and populations sometimes lived in relatively dense settlements. Yet, none of this explains why so many people were killed together. The first possibility is organized violence between competing groups. A raid, territorial conflict, or confrontation over resources could potentially produce a mass death event. In this interpretation, Potočani may preserve the aftermath of a violent encounter between communities. But the remains raise another possibility. The victims appear to have been killed in circumstances where they had little opportunity to defend themselves. Some of the injuries suggest repeated blows, while the distribution of the dead does not resemble a carefully organized burial of combatants. Could this have been an attack on a settlement? Perhaps. The presence of children and individuals of different ages suggests that the victims may have been targeted because of their membership in a particular community rather than their ability to fight. There is also evidence that some individuals suffered injuries from behind or in vulnerable areas of the body. Such patterns can sometimes indicate surprise attacks, restraint, or situations in which victims were unable to respond effectively. But even this interpretation remains incomplete. Why were the bodies placed together? Was the mass grave created immediately after the killings, or did the burial process unfold over time? Were the victims members of the same settlement? Did the perpetrators belong to a neighboring community? Archaeology can approach these questions through isotopic analysis, genetics, trauma patterns, and the study of material culture. These methods can reveal where people grew up, how closely related they were, and whether they shared a common geographic origin. Yet, the motives behind violence are much harder to recover. Some researchers have considered explanations involving resource competition, social tensions, or conflict between neighboring communities. More speculative interpretations have proposed episodes of collective punishment or deliberate destruction of a particular group. There is no evidence, however, that allows one explanation to be declared definitive. The chronology is equally significant. Potočani belongs to a period when communities across Europe were becoming increasingly interconnected, but also increasingly vulnerable to disputes over land, livestock, water, and social power. Agriculture could provide stability, but it could also create something new, possessions worth defending. A settlement with stored food, cultivated land, animals, and established territory had more to lose than a small mobile group. As communities became rooted in particular places, conflict could acquire consequences that were previously less common. Still, the Potočani grave is not simply a record of prehistoric warfare. It is a human tragedy preserved in bone. 41 people, from children to adults, were placed together in the earth after violent deaths more than 6,000 years ago. Their names are unknown. Their voices are gone. Only the pattern of fractures, the arrangement of skeletons, and traces within the surrounding soil remain. Perhaps the grave records a single devastating attack. Perhaps it represents the aftermath of a conflict whose causes were never recorded. Or perhaps the people of Potočani were caught within a larger episode of social upheaval that archaeologists have only begun to recognize. The evidence tells us that they died violently. It cannot yet tell us who ordered the violence, why these particular people were chosen, or what happened in the hours before the grave was filled. And so, beneath the quiet Croatian landscape, one question remains suspended in the archaeological record. What happened at Potočani that brought so many lives to the same place at the same moment, and left their final story buried for more than 6,000 years? From the mass grave at Potočani, our journey moves forward into Iron Age Central Europe, toward a settlement where archaeology reveals a very different relationship with death. Near modern Manching in Bavaria, Germany, archaeologists uncovered evidence of a Celtic settlement whose enormous scale, fortified walls, ritual deposits, and unusual human remains suggest that this was far more than an ordinary place of habitation. Manching developed during the later Iron Age, reaching its greatest importance during the 2nd and 1st centuries BC. The settlement became one of the largest known Celtic urban centers north of the Alps, surrounded by massive defensive walls and connected to extensive trade networks. Yet, beneath this impressive settlement lies a darker archaeological question. Among the discoveries were human remains deposited in unusual contexts, including skulls and bones that appear to have been deliberately selected, manipulated, or placed within particular areas. Archaeologists have long considered whether some of these deposits were connected with ritual activity. The Celtic peoples of Iron Age Europe left no extensive written record of their own religious practices. Most surviving descriptions come from Greek and Roman authors, written from outside the communities they described. These accounts mention sacrifices and religious specialists, but they must be treated cautiously because they were shaped by foreign perspectives. At Manching, the physical evidence provides another, more complicated source. Some human remains were deposited alongside weapons, animals, pottery, or other valuable objects. Such combinations may indicate ritual offerings rather than ordinary disposal. In certain cases, human bones appear to have been intentionally placed in locations that carried symbolic importance. But what kind of ritual? One possibility is sacrifice. In many prehistoric and historic societies, offerings were made to supernatural powers believed to influence fertility, warfare, weather, or prosperity. Valuable objects, animals, and occasionally humans could be dedicated in ceremonies intended to establish or restore a relationship between the community and the divine. Could something similar have occurred at Manching? The evidence does not provide a simple answer. Human remains found within settlements can have many explanations. They may represent victims of violence, individuals whose bodies were treated differently after death, or people whose remains were incorporated into rituals connected with ancestors and community identity. The presence of weapons adds another layer. Iron Age Celtic communities placed considerable value on martial identity. Weapons could represent status, achievement, and social authority. Depositing such objects in ritual contexts may therefore have carried meanings connected with warfare or the social position of the individual. Some researchers have proposed that certain human remains at Manching could be associated with violent ritual practices. Others emphasize the possibility that these were carefully structured deposits rather than evidence of systematic human sacrifice. That distinction matters. A skull placed deliberately within a settlement does not automatically prove that its owner was sacrificed. It might instead have belonged to someone who died in conflict and whose remains later acquired symbolic significance. The archaeological record can reveal the final position of a bone. It cannot always reveal the ceremony that brought it there. More speculative interpretations sometimes envision Manching as a major ritual center where religious specialists conducted ceremonies involving human offerings. Such interpretations draw partly upon classical descriptions of Celtic religion, but they remain difficult to prove archaeologically. There is another possibility, that the ritual deposits were exceptional precisely because they were unusual. Perhaps they occurred only during moments of crisis, war, famine, political upheaval, or threats to the community. An extraordinary offering might have been intended to restore balance when ordinary rituals were believed to be insufficient. Manching's scale makes this question particularly compelling. This was not an isolated rural settlement. It was a major center with organized defenses, craft production, trade, and a large population. Its inhabitants lived within a complex social system in which religion, politics, warfare, and commerce may have been closely connected. Within such a society, ritual could have served many purposes. It might have reinforced political authority, commemorated victories, marked sacred places, or mediated relationships between the community and forces believed to govern the natural world. But the people of Manching left no direct explanation. The remains are silent, and the surviving evidence allows several interpretations to coexist. Sacrifice, punishment, warfare, ancestor veneration, and symbolic deposition may each explain parts of the archaeological picture without fully explaining the whole. As excavation continues to reveal new details about the settlement, the central question remains open. Were the human remains at Manching traces of deliberate sacrifice, the aftermath of violence, or fragments of a ritual system whose true meaning disappeared with the Celtic world that created it? From the ritual deposits of Manching, our journey moves farther east, toward the upper reaches of the Kabur region, where the ruins of Tel Fakhariyah preserve another kind of archaeological puzzle. Here, amid the remains of an ancient settlement in modern northeastern Syria, fragments of monumental sculpture reveal evidence of deliberate destruction: broken stone faces, damaged bodies, and objects whose original setting may have carried a meaning now difficult to reconstruct. Tel Fakhariyah is best known for a remarkable bilingual inscription discovered on a basalt statue in 1979. The inscription, written in both Akkadian and Aramaic, is one of the most important pieces of evidence for the development of Aramaic writing and the political world of the early 1st millennium BC. But the statue itself raises questions beyond the inscription. The figure represents a standing male, wearing a long robe and holding objects associated with authority. Its posture is formal and controlled, suggesting that it was created to represent an important individual. The accompanying text identifies the figure as Hadad Yisi, ruler of Guzana, and dedicates the statue to the storm god Hadad. At first, the object appears straightforward, a ruler commemorating himself through a religious dedication. Yet archaeology rarely leaves an object untouched by later history. The statue was eventually buried, and other sculptures from the region show signs of damage or deliberate alteration. Faces could be broken, inscriptions defaced, and monuments removed from their original settings. Such treatment is especially significant because destroying an image was not necessarily the same as simply discarding an unwanted object. In the ancient Near East, images could carry political and religious meaning. A statue might embody the authority of a ruler, commemorate an individual, or function as a physical presence within a sacred space. Damaging that image could therefore have symbolic consequences. But was the destruction at Tel Fakhariyah deliberate? In some cases, the evidence appears to suggest intentional damage. Yet, archaeologists must distinguish between deliberate destruction, accidental breakage, later reuse, and damage caused by burial or environmental forces. A fallen monument can fracture naturally. A statue moved for construction can lose its head. A buried object may be damaged by pressure over centuries. So, why consider deliberate destruction at all? Because patterns matter. When damage occurs in particular locations, especially around faces, inscriptions, or identifying features, it can suggest purposeful intervention. Ancient societies sometimes attacked images precisely because those images represented people, gods, or institutions that had become politically unacceptable. This possibility becomes especially interesting in regions where kingdoms repeatedly changed hands. Tel Fakhariyah stood within a landscape shaped by Assyrian expansion, Aramaean kingdoms, shifting alliances, and competing centers of power. Political control could change rapidly. A monument created under one ruler might become a reminder of a previous regime under another. Could destroying an image have been a way of erasing authority? Perhaps. Yet there is another interpretation. The damage might have been connected with ritual rather than political hostility. Some ancient traditions treated statues as objects capable of receiving symbolic attention, and the manipulation of an image could have formed part of a ceremony intended to deactivate, transform, or relocate its significance. The distinction between political destruction and ritual transformation is not always obvious. A broken face might represent hatred toward the person depicted. It might also represent an attempt to neutralize the power associated with the image. More speculative interpretations sometimes connect damaged monuments with episodes of deliberate iconoclasm, in which rulers or communities sought to erase the memory of predecessors. In such scenarios, the destruction of a statue becomes part of a broader campaign against political identity. But the surviving evidence at Tel Fakhariyah does not allow such a dramatic conclusion to be accepted automatically. The bilingual inscription offers an unusually rare voice from the ancient world. It tells us that Haddad-Yisi presented himself as a ruler under divine protection, and that the statue was connected with religious devotion. Yet, even this extraordinary text cannot tell us what happened to the monument centuries later. Who broke it? When was it damaged? Was the destruction carried out by enemies, successors, religious authorities, or ordinary people reusing the stone? And was the damage intended to erase a memory, or to transform the meaning of an object that had once carried authority? The uncertainty is part of what makes Tel Fakhariyah so compelling. A statue can survive for thousands of years, while the political world that created it disappears completely. Its inscription may preserve a ruler's name, yet the later treatment of the monument can reveal an entirely different chapter, one written not in words, but in fractures. Even the act of burial may have been significant. Was the statue deliberately placed underground to protect it, conceal it, or remove it from public view? Was it abandoned during a period of political upheaval? Or did later inhabitants simply find another use for a monument whose original purpose no longer mattered? There may never be a single answer. What remains is a damaged figure, a remarkable bilingual inscription, and the archaeological traces of a society in which images, rulers, gods, and political memory were closely intertwined. And as the broken stone continues to speak through its surviving details, one question remains open. When the people who came after Haddad-Yisi damaged or buried his image, were they destroying the memory of a ruler, or attempting to silence the power that his statue still represented? From the damaged monuments of Tel Fakhariyah, our journey moves much farther back in time, to a period long before kingdoms, inscriptions, or monumental rulers existed. In a narrow valley near the Jordan Valley, beneath layers of sediment accumulated over thousands of years, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a settlement known as Wadi Hammeh 27. At first, the site appears modest. There are stone tools, animal bones, fragments of hearths, and traces of structures belonging to hunter-gatherers who lived roughly 12,000 years ago. Yet, among these ordinary remains are carefully constructed stone platforms whose purpose remains difficult to define. Wadi Hammeh 27 belongs to the late Epipaleolithic period, associated with the Natufian culture. These communities lived during a critical stage in human development, when people were beginning to establish more permanent settlements while still relying heavily on wild plants and animals. The architecture reflects this transition. Large, circular structures were constructed using stone, sometimes incorporating carefully prepared surfaces and substantial walls. The settlement contains evidence of repeated occupation, suggesting that people returned to the location or remained there for significant periods. But the stone platforms are particularly intriguing. They were not simply natural outcrops. Their surfaces were deliberately prepared, and their placement appears connected with the organization of the settlement. Some features were built into or alongside architectural spaces, while others appear to have served specialized functions. What were they for? The most practical explanation is that they were work surfaces, installations associated with food processing, craft production, or other everyday activities. Hunter-gatherer settlements required places for preparing plants, processing animals, shaping tools, and carrying out routine tasks. Yet, the construction effort raises another possibility. Some of the platforms appear more carefully made than would be necessary for temporary domestic activity. Their arrangement within the settlement may indicate that certain spaces carried social or symbolic significance. This is where interpretation becomes difficult. Archaeologists can identify stone, sediment, tool marks, hearths, and activity areas. They can reconstruct the sequence in which structures were built and modified, but the meaning attached to a particular platform belonged to the people who used it. Perhaps the stones supported activities that were simply practical. Perhaps they marked spaces where people gathered. Or perhaps certain platforms were connected with rituals whose physical traces were subtle enough to disappear almost completely. The timing makes the question especially important. Wadi Hammeh 27 dates to a period when communities in the southern Levant were undergoing major changes. The Natufian culture is associated with increasing sedentism, more substantial architecture, elaborate burials, ornaments, long-distance exchange, and changing relationships with the surrounding landscape. These developments occurred before the fully established agricultural villages of the later Neolithic. In other words, Wadi Hammeh 27 belongs to a world standing close to one of humanity's major transformations. People were still hunting gazelle and gathering wild plants, yet they were investing more effort into permanent or semi-permanent structures. They were building places that required planning, maintenance, and collective labor. Why? One possibility is simply efficiency. Remaining in productive areas for longer periods would have made investment in architecture worthwhile. Another possibility involves social identity. A permanent structure can become more than shelter. It can mark belonging, create gathering places, and give a community a physical center. The stone platforms may have played some role within this emerging social landscape. More speculative interpretations have proposed that unusual architectural features at Natufian sites could reflect ceremonial or communal activities. Some have even suggested that certain carefully constructed surfaces were associated with ritual performances or symbolic displays. There is no definitive evidence that the platforms were sacred, yet the possibility cannot be completely excluded. The surrounding discoveries add subtle clues. At Wadi Hammeh 27, archaeologists found evidence of stoneworking, animal processing, plant use, ornaments, and repeated occupation. Such diversity suggests a settlement where different activities overlapped. A platform used for food preparation could therefore also have become a place where people gathered, talked, exchanged objects, or performed actions carrying meanings invisible to us. The distinction between ordinary and ceremonial space may have been far less rigid than it is today. Even the choice of stone could matter. Building with durable material required effort, and the decision to construct a feature rather than simply use the natural ground suggests some degree of intention. But intention alone does not reveal purpose. The people who built Wadi Hammeh 27 left no written record. Their world survives through fragments: stone flakes, hearths, animal bones, architectural outlines, and carefully arranged surfaces. From these traces, archaeology can reconstruct patterns of behavior, but not the thoughts that accompanied them. Perhaps the platforms were simply practical installations created by skilled hunter-gatherers adapting to a more settled existence. Perhaps they were communal spaces, or components of activities that combined work, gathering, and ritual. And perhaps some of the meanings attached to these stones were so familiar to their builders that no explanation was ever considered necessary. Today, the platforms remain remarkably quiet witnesses to a turning point in human history, a time when people were beginning to invest more deeply in particular places, long before agriculture had transformed the landscape. Their stones have survived. The purpose behind them has not, and that leaves an enduring question. Were the platforms of Wadi Hammeh 27 simply functional structures belonging to an increasingly settled community, or did they mark spaces whose social and symbolic importance has been almost completely erased by 12,000 years of time? From the carefully built stone platforms of Wadi Hammeh 27, our journey moves toward another settlement that pushes the story of monumental construction even farther into prehistory. Near the northern Syrian city of Aleppo, on a low mound overlooking the Quake River, archaeologists uncovered the remains of Tel Qaramel, a site where people were constructing substantial circular towers thousands of years before the great urban centers of the ancient Near East. The first impression is deceptive. Today, the mound is quiet and largely unremarkable. But beneath its surface lay architectural remains belonging to communities living during the transition from mobile hunter-gatherers toward increasingly settled societies. At Tel Qaramel, archaeologists identified a sequence of 5 circular stone towers, built and rebuilt over several phases. Their earliest construction has been dated to around the 10th millennium BC, making the site one of the earliest known examples of monumental stone architecture. That date changes the significance of the structure. The builders were not members of an established kingdom. They had no written language, no metal tools, and no cities in the later sense. They belonged to prehistoric communities whose economies depended heavily on hunting, gathering, and gradually more intensive exploitation of plants and animals. Yet, they invested considerable labor in stone construction. The towers were circular, with stone walls enclosing relatively small internal spaces. Some were rebuilt repeatedly, suggesting that the structures remained important enough for later generations to repair or reconstruct them. Why? The simplest explanation is practical. A tower could have served as a lookout, storage facility, shelter, or communal structure. Its elevated position may have provided a useful vantage point over the surrounding landscape. In a settlement where resources, animals, and neighboring groups mattered, visibility could have practical value. But the architecture raises difficulties for such straightforward interpretations. The towers were relatively small, and their internal spaces do not clearly indicate a single function. Some contained hearths or associated activity areas, while others lack obvious evidence for long-term domestic use. Perhaps they were multi-purpose structures. A place could serve as a lookout at one moment, a gathering space at another, and a location for activities that we would classify as ceremonial. This possibility becomes more interesting when the wider settlement is considered. Tel Qaramel was not simply a single isolated tower. The site contains evidence of repeated occupation, domestic structures, hearths, tools, animal remains, and other traces of daily life. The towers formed part of a changing community landscape. They may therefore reflect an important shift in how people understood the places where they lived. A structure that requires collective construction can create a focal point. It gives a community something permanent to maintain, revisit, and recognize. Even if its original function was practical, it could gradually acquire social meaning. The repeated rebuilding of the towers is particularly significant. Why reconstruct the same architectural form again and again? Perhaps because the location remained strategically useful. perhaps because rebuilding was simply more efficient than creating an entirely new structure. Or perhaps the tower itself had become important independently of its practical function. More speculative interpretations have proposed that the structures may have served communal or ritual purposes, possibly associated with gatherings, ceremonies, or seasonal activities. Such interpretations are difficult to confirm because the archaeological evidence does not preserve the beliefs of the people who built them. Still, the broader archaeological context offers an important clue. Tel Qaramel belongs to a period of profound change in the Near East. Communities were beginning to spend longer periods in fixed locations, developing new forms of architecture, intensifying their use of local resources, and creating increasingly complex social relationships. The tower may therefore represent more than a piece of early engineering. It may reflect a new relationship between people and place. A mobile group can leave a landscape behind. A settled community must invest in it. Walls must be maintained. Hearths must be rebuilt. Structures must be repaired. Paths become familiar. Certain locations acquire importance. Architecture becomes memory expressed in stone. Yet, the precise reason for constructing the towers remains uncertain. Were they defensive structures? There is little evidence for large-scale warfare at the earliest phases, and their small dimensions make a purely military interpretation difficult. Were they observation posts? Their elevated setting could have helped people monitor the surrounding area, but there is no conclusive evidence that surveillance was their primary purpose. Were they communal or ceremonial spaces? Their repeated reconstruction may support such a possibility, but the absence of unmistakable ritual installations leaves the interpretation open. Perhaps their function changed over time. A tower built for one purpose may later have acquired another. As generations passed, its meaning could have shifted while its physical form remained familiar. That possibility is especially important when studying prehistoric architecture. We often search for one original function, yet human places rarely remain fixed in meaning. The people of Tel Qaramel left no inscription explaining why they built these towers. They left stone walls, hearths, tools, animal remains, and layers of rebuilding. From those traces, archaeologists can reconstruct a sequence of construction stretching back roughly 12,000 years. But the intention behind the first stones remains beyond direct observation. What compelled a prehistoric community to gather labor, select stone, build upward, and then return to the same architectural form across generations? Perhaps the answer was practical. Perhaps it was social. Or perhaps the tower represented something that mattered deeply to its builders, but left no material signature we can recognize today. And as the earliest stones of Tel Qaramel continue to survive beneath the Syrian landscape, another question remains open. Were these towers simply useful structures created by increasingly settled communities? Or were they early expressions of a social and symbolic world whose true purpose has not yet been recovered? From the earliest towers of Tel Qaramel, our journey moves deeper into the world of the first settled communities, toward the rugged landscapes of southeastern Anatolia, where the archaeological site of Çayönü preserves evidence of a society undergoing one of humanity's most consequential transformations. Today, the settlement lies beneath a quiet landscape of fields and low hills. But thousands of years ago, this was a place of experimentation. People were building permanent structures, cultivating plants, managing animals, crafting tools, and developing new ways to organize communal life. Çayönü was occupied for thousands of years, beginning around the 10th millennium BC. Its inhabitants lived during the transition from mobile hunter-gathering toward increasingly settled communities associated with the early Neolithic. And beneath their buildings, they sometimes placed the dead. Human burials have been found within architectural spaces at Çayönü, including beneath floors and inside buildings. This practice was not unique to the site. Across early Neolithic communities of the Near East, people sometimes buried relatives beneath houses, returning to places where the dead remained physically connected to the living. But Çayönü presents a particularly rich and complicated record. Some individuals were buried in relatively simple graves. Others were placed in locations associated with specific architectural features. The arrangement of bodies, the position of the graves, and the repeated rebuilding of structures above them suggests that burial was not always a single, isolated event. A house could contain the remains of people who had lived there generations earlier. Why would the living choose to build directly above their dead? The most conventional explanation is ancestor-related practice. Keeping deceased relatives within domestic spaces may have maintained a physical connection between generations. The dead remained part of the household landscape rather than being separated into distant cemeteries. But the evidence may point toward something more complex. Çayönü contains several distinctive architectural phases and specialized buildings, including structures that appear to have served communal or ceremonial purposes. Some human remains were associated with unusual contexts, making it difficult to separate ordinary domestic burial from ritual activity. In one important area, known as the Skull Building, large numbers of human skeletal remains were discovered, including skulls and other bones. The building underwent several phases of use, and the remains appear to have been repeatedly handled and rearranged. The implications are difficult to ignore. Why collect human skulls? One explanation is ancestor veneration. The skull may have been regarded as a particularly important representation of the deceased, perhaps retaining a person's identity or social presence after death. This idea fits with broader Neolithic practices in the Near East, where skulls were sometimes removed, modified, plastered, or displayed. But Çayönü adds its own complexity. The remains were not necessarily treated in the same way as ordinary household burials. Their concentration within a specialized building suggests that the site may have served a communal purpose. Perhaps people gathered there during ceremonies associated with the dead. Perhaps skulls were temporarily displayed before being returned to the earth. Or perhaps the building represented a place where the community negotiated relationships between ancestors, living members, and collective identity. There are also traces that have generated more controversial interpretations. Some human remains show evidence of trauma, while other bones display signs of modification or unusual treatment. Such evidence has sometimes encouraged theories involving ritual violence, sacrifice, or violent ceremonies. Yet trauma alone cannot establish sacrifice. People could die from conflict, accidents, hunting injuries, or interpersonal violence. Even when a body was later treated in an unusual way, the original cause of death may have been entirely ordinary. This distinction is crucial. The archaeological record preserves physical events, but not the beliefs that surrounded them. More speculative interpretations propose that the skull building may have been connected with ceremonies involving selected individuals whose remains acquired special significance. Others have suggested that skulls might have been used to maintain social memory, allowing communities to preserve the presence of particular ancestors long after their deaths. There is no surviving text to confirm either possibility. What we can observe is repetition. People returned to these spaces. They rebuilt structures. They buried individuals beneath floors. They handled human remains. They preserved certain bones and moved them within architectural settings. This suggests that death was not regarded as a final separation. The dead remained embedded within the settlement itself. That relationship may have had practical consequences as well. A building containing ancestral remains could become a place of identity, linking families to particular spaces and perhaps strengthening claims over land and resources. In a society becoming increasingly settled, that connection could have been powerful. The landscape was no longer simply somewhere people passed through. It became home, and home contained the dead. Yet, the precise meaning of the skulls and unusual burials remains uncertain. Were they expressions of ancestor veneration? Were they part of communal ceremonies? Did some individuals receive special treatment because of their social position? Or were the remains connected with episodes of violence whose significance has been misunderstood? Perhaps several explanations are correct at once. The people of Çayönü may have possessed a complex funerary tradition in which burial, remembrance, ritual, and social identity overlapped. What remains remarkable is that nearly 12,000 years later, the settlement still preserves traces of these relationships. Beneath floors once walked across by the living, the bones of earlier generations remained in place. Within specialized buildings, skulls and other remains were gathered and rearranged. The architecture itself became part of a continuing dialogue between those who had died and those who remained. And yet the most important part of that dialogue is missing: the words, beliefs, and ceremonies that gave the bones their meaning. So the question remains: when the people of Çayönü placed their dead beneath their homes and gathered human remains within special buildings, were they preserving ancestors, transforming the dead into symbols of communal identity, or participating in rituals whose purpose has been almost completely erased by time? From the human remains preserved beneath the houses of Çayönü, our journey moves thousands of years forward and far to the east, into the Minusinsk Basin of southern Siberia. Here, along the Yenisei River and among the windswept valleys of the Sayan region, archaeologists encountered a funerary tradition unlike almost anything else in the ancient Eurasian world. The most striking objects are masks. Made from plaster, clay, and other materials, some Tashtyk funerary masks were modeled over the faces of the dead. Their features could be remarkably individualized. Eyes were carefully shaped, mouths defined, and faces sometimes painted with red, black, or other pigments. A few masks appear almost portrait-like, creating an unsettling sense that someone from a distant age is still looking back through the material. The Tashtyk culture flourished in the Minusinsk Basin during the first centuries A.D., generally dated from around the 1st to the 7th century A.D. These communities practiced agriculture, animal husbandry, hunting, and crafts, while maintaining connections across the wider steppe and forest steppe zones of southern Siberia. Their treatment of the dead was particularly elaborate. Tashtyk burials included both inhumation and cremation. Some graves contained richly equipped individuals, while others involved complex funerary constructions. In certain cases, bodies were cremated, and the remains were placed within burial containers or structures that could include representations of the deceased. And this is where the masks become especially intriguing. Why create a physical face for someone who was no longer alive? The most straightforward interpretation is memorial representation. A mask could preserve the identity of the deceased, allowing the community to maintain a recognizable image after death. In societies where memory depended heavily on objects, places, and oral traditions, a carefully constructed face may have served as a powerful link between generations. But Tashtyk funerary practices appear to have gone beyond simple remembrance. Some masks show signs of deliberate alteration. Others contain painted features or distinctive markings. Researchers have observed differences in facial representation that may reflect age, sex, social identity, or ritual conventions. Could these masks have been portraits? Possibly. Some are individualized enough to suggest that the makers may have attempted to reproduce the appearance of particular people. Yet, portraiture in the modern sense may not have been the goal. The face could have represented social identity rather than physical appearance alone. A mask might communicate who someone was, which group they belonged to, or how they were expected to be remembered. Then there is the question of cremation. Fire fundamentally changes the physical body. After cremation, the recognizable face disappears. Yet, Tashtyk funerary traditions sometimes preserved or recreated facial identity through masks and other representations. Was this a way of restoring what fire had taken away? One interpretation suggests that the mask symbolically reconstructed the person after the body had been transformed. The deceased could be reduced to cremated remains, yet the face remained visible as a representation. This creates a fascinating tension between destruction and preservation. The body disappears. The face remains. Some researchers have suggested that the masks may have been connected with beliefs about the soul, the afterlife, or the transformation of the deceased. These interpretations are reasonable within the broader funerary context, but direct evidence is limited. There are no Tashtyk religious texts explaining the ceremonies. There are only graves, masks, burial structures, artifacts, and traces of deliberate human activity. More speculative theories have proposed that some masks represented ancestors or spiritual beings rather than literal portraits. Others have suggested that the facial features may encode information about identity or social status. Such possibilities cannot easily be confirmed. The archaeological evidence also reveals another intriguing practice. Miniature human figures and other representations sometimes accompanied funerary contexts. These objects suggest that Tashtyk mortuary traditions were concerned not merely with disposing of the dead, but with representing them. Perhaps the dead needed a recognizable identity in another realm. Perhaps the living needed a recognizable face to continue remembering them. Or perhaps both ideas were connected. The masks also raise questions about artistic skill. Creating a convincing human face requires close observation and technical ability. The makers worked with materials that could be shaped, dried, painted, and sometimes modified. Producing these objects would have required knowledge passed between generations. Yet the masks are not identical. Some appear solemn. Some have exaggerated features. Others possess individualized details that make them seem almost like portraits of specific people. Were these differences intentional? If so, what did they communicate? A mask depicting a particular facial characteristic may have been intended to preserve personal identity, but it could also have been symbolic, transforming the deceased into an idealized or socially meaningful figure. The boundary between portrait and ritual representation remains uncertain. There is another possibility, more speculative but difficult to dismiss entirely. Perhaps the masks were not designed solely for the dead. They may have been part of ceremonies in which the living interacted with representations of deceased relatives before burial was completed. If such rituals existed, the mask could have functioned as a temporary presence, a face through which the deceased remained socially visible. Eventually, however, the ceremony ended. The mask entered the burial context. Centuries passed. The people who had made and worn these objects disappeared, but their crafted faces survived beneath the earth. Today, they provide one of the most remarkable glimpses into how a prehistoric society may have understood identity after death. Yet, the central question remains beyond certainty. Were the Tashtyk masks portraits meant to preserve individual faces, symbolic identities created for the afterlife, or ritual objects that temporarily allowed the dead to remain present among the living? The materials survived. The faces survived. But the meaning behind those faces did not. And somewhere within that silence lies the enduring puzzle. When Tashtyk communities recreated the faces of their dead, were they trying to preserve a person's identity, or to give the deceased a new identity for whatever came after the final ceremony? From the painted funerary faces of the Tashtyk people, our journey now turns to something far smaller, yet deeply personal: the tools once used to mark the human body. Somewhere between stone, pigment, skin, and ceremony lies one of humanity's oldest forms of expression, the deliberate transformation of the body itself. But the designation WB76 presents a problem. Unlike well-documented archaeological sites and artifact groups, this exact designation is not readily identifiable in the established archaeological literature as a recognized prehistoric tattooing assemblage. That uncertainty matters. The evidence for ancient tattooing is real and extensive, but attaching a specific interpretation to an obscure catalog number without a secure archaeological source would risk turning an intriguing clue into a historical certainty. What can be established is that tattooing reaches deep into prehistory. Across different parts of the world, archaeologists have discovered pointed implements capable of piercing skin, together with pigments that may have been introduced into wounds to create permanent marks. Some tools are remarkably simple: sharpened bone, flint points, or clusters of tiny stone elements. Their appearance can be almost indistinguishable from ordinary cutting or piercing equipment, and that is where the investigation becomes difficult. A small pointed tool does not announce its purpose. It may have been used to puncture leather, work animal hides, drill soft materials, or create decorative objects. It may have been used on the human body. Without preserved skin, pigment residues, or microscopic traces of repeated use, archaeologists must examine the entire context. Yet, the idea of prehistoric tattooing is no longer speculative. The frozen body, commonly known as Utsi, who lived during the 4th millennium BC, preserves more than 60 tattoos on his skin. The marks were produced by repeatedly puncturing the body and introducing dark pigment. Their location suggests that tattooing was not necessarily decorative in the modern sense. Some have been discussed in relation to physical pain or therapeutic practices. Elsewhere, archaeological evidence points toward even earlier body marking. Bone and stone implements from prehistoric contexts have been examined for microscopic wear patterns consistent with repeated contact against skin. In some cases, pigment residues strengthen the interpretation. These discoveries suggest that marking the body may have emerged independently in different regions or developed as part of very early symbolic traditions. So, what might a group of tattooing tools have meant to the people who possess them? The practical explanation is straightforward. They may have been instruments for permanently marking individuals, but the purpose of those marks is much harder to reconstruct. A tattoo can communicate identity. It can indicate membership in a family, community, age group, or social category. It can commemorate an event, express status, or mark a transition from one stage of life to another. It can also be deeply personal. For prehistoric communities, the body itself was one of the few surfaces that traveled with a person everywhere. A mark placed on the skin could remain visible throughout life, even when clothing, possessions, or settlements changed. Could this explain the persistence of tattooing across distant cultures? Perhaps. The practice may have provided a durable form of identity at a time when written names did not exist. There is also a ritual possibility. Body modification frequently appears in societies where important life transitions are expressed physically. Initiation, adulthood, marriage, mourning, warrior status, or religious affiliation can all be represented through changes to the body. A tattoo could therefore have functioned as a permanent record of belonging. More speculative interpretations go further, proposing that prehistoric tattooing may sometimes have been associated with healing, protection, ancestry, or communication with supernatural forces. Such interpretations are difficult to test archaeologically because the marks themselves rarely preserve their original meaning. Even when a tattoo survives on ancient skin, we can observe its location and pattern without knowing the words or beliefs that accompanied the procedure. and the tools provide even less information. A collection of pointed implements could tell us that repeated piercing occurred. Pigment residues could suggest coloring. Microscopic wear could reveal how the objects were used. But none of these clues can tell us exactly what the person receiving the marks felt, believed, or hoped to become. That is perhaps what makes prehistoric tattooing so compelling. Unlike a monument, a tattoo is carried by a living human being. The stone tool may survive for thousands of years, but the ceremony surrounding its use disappears almost completely. Perhaps several people gathered around a fire while one experienced practitioner worked slowly on another person's skin. Perhaps the procedure marked a rite of passage. Perhaps it commemorated an ancestor. Or perhaps it was a treatment intended to relieve pain. The possibilities are numerous, and this is where WB-76 must remain an unresolved designation rather than a confirmed archaeological story. Until a primary excavation report, museum record, or scholarly publication establishes exactly what the label refers to, it should not be presented as definitive evidence of a particular prehistoric tattooing tradition. The broader evidence, however, leaves little doubt that humans have been deliberately marking their bodies for thousands of years. What remains uncertain is why. Were the earliest tattoos symbols of identity, records of experience, forms of healing, expressions of belief, or something even more personal that cannot be recovered from archaeological evidence? The tools themselves remain silent. They can reveal how a mark might have been made. They cannot reveal what that mark meant. And perhaps that is the enduring mystery of prehistoric tattooing. When ancient people pierced their own skin and permanently altered their bodies, were they simply decorating themselves, or were they carrying messages, identities, and beliefs that disappeared the moment their world fell silent? From the uncertain traces of prehistoric tattooing, our journey now moves far south, into the forested highlands of Cameroon, where a small rock shelter preserves an extraordinary record of human lives separated by thousands of years. At Shum, Laka, beneath layers of sediment and ash, archaeologists uncovered human burials that would eventually challenge assumptions about population history, ancestry, and the movement of people through Central Africa. The site lies within the grassfields region of northwestern Cameroon, an area of volcanic highlands, fertile soils, and deep valleys. Today, vegetation surrounds the landscape, but the rock shelter itself offered something prehistoric communities repeatedly needed: protection, water nearby, and a place that could be revisited across generations. People used Shum Laka for an exceptionally long period. Archaeological evidence indicates occupation beginning more than 30,000 years ago, although the most important burials date to much later, roughly between 8,000 and 3,000 BC. These remains belong to a period when human communities across Central Africa were adapting to changing environments and developing increasingly complex relationships with particular places. Then, in the shelter, archaeologists found 4 burials that would become especially important. 2 of the individuals were children. Genetic research later revealed that these children belonged to a deeply divergent lineage that does not closely resemble most present-day populations living in the region. That discovery transformed the significance of Shum Laka. The site had already been important because of its antiquity and archaeological record. But ancient DNA revealed something far more unexpected. The people buried there were not straightforward ancestors of the populations who inhabit the surrounding region today. How could a place be occupied repeatedly by people whose genetic descendants later became difficult to identify? The answer may lie in the enormous complexity of African population history. For decades, archaeological models sometimes treated populations as though they moved across landscapes in relatively simple waves, replacing earlier groups as new technologies or economies appeared. Genetic evidence has shown that the reality was considerably more complicated. Populations could move, mix, fragment, disappear from particular regions, and later be replaced or absorbed by other communities. Shum Laka provides a rare glimpse into one of those earlier populations. The 4 individuals were buried in different ways. 2 children, dating to around 8000 BC and 7000 BC, were buried together in one context. Another child and an adolescent were buried in later periods. Their placement suggests that the shelter continued to have social significance long after the earliest burials. But why were these particular individuals buried there? The simplest explanation is that they belonged to communities using Shum Laka as a residential or ceremonial location. Their deaths may have been handled according to local customs, with burial taking place within a familiar landscape. Yet, the genetic evidence raises another question. If these people were not closely related to most modern populations in the region, does that mean their community disappeared? Not necessarily. Genetic ancestry can disappear from a region without every individual or cultural practice disappearing with it. Populations can be absorbed through intermarriage, demographic change, migration, or shifts in settlement patterns. A community can cease to exist as a distinct population, while parts of its ancestry continue elsewhere. The absence of a clear modern descendant population, therefore, does not mean that the people of Shum Laka simply disappeared. It means their history is more difficult to trace. The ancient genomes have also contributed to a broader understanding of the deep population structure of Africa. Genetic studies indicate that the continent has hosted multiple deeply separated human lineages for tens of thousands of years. The individuals from Shum Laka appear to represent one of these early branches. Their ancestry is especially interesting because it is not closely aligned with the populations associated with the later expansion of Bantu-speaking communities across much of Central and Southern Africa. That distinction matters. The Bantu expansions, beginning several thousand years ago, transformed the demographic and linguistic landscape of enormous regions. Farming, ironworking, languages, and new settlement patterns spread across Central Africa and beyond. But Shum Laka shows that people were already living in the region long before those later transformations. They were not simply an empty population waiting for newcomers. They had their own communities, traditions, and biological history. And they buried their dead. The unusual aspect of the burials is therefore not necessarily that they were ritualistically bizarre. Their greatest significance may lie in the contrast between the archaeological continuity of the place and the genetic discontinuity revealed by the remains. A shelter could remain meaningful while the population using it changed. A landscape could preserve memories even when the people who created those memories were no longer present. This raises an intriguing possibility. Perhaps Shum Laka was repeatedly used because the location itself held significance. Its rock walls may have served as a landmark, a gathering point, or a place associated with ancestral traditions. Burial in such a setting could have connected the dead with a landscape that remained familiar across generations. Yet, the evidence does not tell us whether the burials were ordinary or exceptional within their own society. Were these children buried according to the same customs used for adults? Did their young age influence how they were treated? Were they members of a particular family or social group? The genetic evidence indicates that the individuals were not all closely related in the way we might expect from a single family cemetery. That may suggest that burial practices were tied to the community or location rather than exclusively to biological kinship. But caution is essential. 4 burials cannot reconstruct an entire society. They provide a narrow window into a much larger population. More speculative interpretations sometimes portray Shum Laka as evidence of a vanished people who were later completely replaced. That possibility is attractive because the genetic distinction is so striking, but replacement is not the only explanation. Population mixing can produce the same archaeological pattern. So can migration. So can demographic collapse followed by absorption into neighboring groups. The ancient DNA tells us that the individuals carried a distinct ancestry. It does not provide a complete narrative of what happened to their descendants. This is where Shum Laka becomes more than a burial site. It becomes a reminder of how incomplete the human record remains. Modern populations are not necessarily simple reflections of the people who occupied the same landscapes thousands of years ago. The past was populated by communities whose descendants may be genetically diluted, geographically displaced, culturally transformed, or impossible to identify today. And the 4 individuals at Shum Laka were part of that forgotten complexity. Their bones survived because the shelter protected them. Their genetic information survived because modern science could recover fragments from ancient material. But the identities of the individuals remain unknown. We do not know their names. We do not know how they lived. We do not know what they believed about death. We cannot hear the language spoken around their graves. We can only reconstruct fragments. The child, buried around 8000 BC, lived in a world very different from the one that exists today. The later burials belong to people who returned to the same broad landscape thousands of years afterward. Between these individuals stretch generations of environmental change, cultural development, movement, and contact. Yet the shelter remained. Perhaps that continuity was deliberate. Perhaps people returned because Shum Laka was simply a useful place. Or perhaps its walls had become part of a collective memory extending farther back than any living person could explain. The most unsettling possibility is not that these people were strangers to the landscape, but that they belonged to a chapter of Central African history that later became almost invisible. Their genetic signatures survived. Their burial places survived. Their presence survived. Their story did not. And so the remains of Shum Laka leave us with a question that archaeology and genetics can approach but cannot fully resolve. Who were the people who buried their children beneath this shelter thousands of years ago? And how did a population once living in the heart of Central Africa become so difficult to recognize in the human landscape that followed? The same climatic processes that helped shape the Tichitt landscape eventually contributed to its transformation. As aridity intensified, grasslands contracted. Water sources became less dependable. Agricultural production became harder to maintain. Communities may have gradually shifted toward other regions or adapted their economies to changing conditions. This raises an intriguing possibility. Perhaps the abandonment of some Tichitt settlements was not caused by a single catastrophe. There may have been no final battle, no dramatic invasion, and no sudden disappearance. Instead, generations may have watched their environment slowly become less hospitable. A settlement that once stood beside productive land could eventually become difficult to sustain. Walls remained, fields changed, water disappeared. People moved, and the stone structures became isolated within an expanding, dry landscape. But another interpretation deserves consideration. Some researchers have emphasized the possibility that social changes, not climate alone, shaped the transformation of Tichitt communities. Competition over resources, changing trade networks, livestock movements, and regional political developments could have influenced where people lived and how they organized themselves. Climate may have created pressure without determining the outcome. The archaeological record rarely provides a single cause for large-scale social change. More speculative interpretations sometimes portray Tichitt as evidence for an unexpectedly advanced urban society in prehistoric West Africa, occasionally comparing its stone settlements with much later cities elsewhere. There is some justification for emphasizing the complexity of the tradition. These were substantial settlements with organized architecture, agriculture, herding, storage, and regional connections. but describing them as cities in the later urban sense can be misleading. Their development followed a different path. There is no evidence for monumental kingship on the scale of Egypt or Mesopotamia. No large writing system records their political structure. No royal tombs identify a ruling dynasty. Their significance lies precisely in that difference. Tichitt demonstrates that complex communities could emerge in West Africa through local adaptation, without reproducing the institutional patterns seen in the ancient Near East. The stone settlements therefore represent more than abandoned architecture. They preserve evidence of people who successfully organized themselves within an environment undergoing profound climatic change. And there is something particularly evocative about their location today. The modern landscape can make the settlements appear almost impossible. How could people farm here? How could livestock survive? How could communities build substantial stone structures in a region now associated with extreme dryness? The answer lies in recognizing that the landscape has changed. The Sahara we see today is not the Sahara these communities knew. Their environment contained resources that later became scarce or disappeared. The stone walls are therefore also records of climate. They mark places where human settlement once made sense. Within those walls, people stored grain, raised animals, prepared food, built households, and raised children. They negotiated relationships, exchanged goods, and responded to environmental uncertainty. The architecture may even have helped reinforce social identity. A settlement built from stone is difficult to ignore. It anchors a community to a particular place. It transforms a landscape into a home. Perhaps that was one of the deeper meanings of the Tichitt structures. Not monuments to individual rulers, but monuments to collective endurance. Yet, even this interpretation remains incomplete. We do not know precisely how the settlements were governed. We do not know whether different compounds belong to distinct families, social ranks, or occupational groups. We do not know how communities responded to periods of drought, conflict, or migration. And we do not know whether the final abandonment of individual settlements was peaceful, gradual, or accompanied by episodes of tension. What survives are fragments of stone arranged across a landscape that has changed dramatically since the people who built them walked there. The walls remain visible. The fields have disappeared. The voices are gone. And perhaps the greatest mystery is not why these communities built with stone, but how much of their social world remains invisible because it was never preserved in durable material. Their architecture tells us that they possessed organization, technical knowledge, and a strong connection to place. It does not tell us what they called themselves. It does not tell us how they understood the changing climate. It does not tell us what they feared, what they valued, or why particular structures mattered enough to preserve. Somewhere within those unanswered questions lies the true significance of Tichitt. The settlements may have been practical centers of agriculture and herding. They may also have been places where identity, authority, and community were expressed through architecture. Perhaps the stone complexes were simply homes made durable against an unpredictable environment. Or perhaps they represented something larger, a physical statement that a community intended to remain rooted in a landscape that was already beginning to change. Today, the stones stand in a much drier world than the one their builders knew. And as the desert continues to surround these ancient settlements, one question remains open. What did the people of Tichitt believe they were building? A place to survive, a center for their community, or a lasting monument to a way of life they could already sense was beginning to disappear? From the wider Tichitt tradition, our journey now moves into the heart of Dhar Tichitt itself, a landscape where prehistoric stone settlements rise from a terrain that today appears almost inhospitable. Across the rocky plateaus of southeastern Mauritania, walls, compounds, stone circles, and carefully arranged structures mark places where people once built permanent communities beside a Sahara that was greener and more productive than the one we know today. The first impression is almost deceptive. The ruins do not resemble the monumental capitals of Egypt or Mesopotamia. There are no towering temples, royal statues, or inscriptions announcing the names of rulers. Instead, Dhar Tichitt preserves something more intimate. Houses, enclosures, storage spaces, pathways, and stone-built compounds arranged according to patterns that reveal a surprisingly organized society. The settlements developed during the 2nd millennium BC, within what archaeologists call the Tichitt tradition. At that time, southeastern Mauritania was experiencing a climate considerably more favorable to human settlement than the present desert environment suggests. Seasonal rainfall supported grasses and vegetation. Temporary lakes and drainage channels provided water. Herd animals could graze, while cultivated crops could be grown in suitable soils. People adapted to this landscape by combining agriculture with pastoralism. Millet cultivation appears to have been important, while cattle, sheep, and goats contributed to the economy. Hunting and gathering continued as well, creating a mixed way of life that was flexible enough to respond to changing conditions. But the most visible expression of this society is stone. Large quantities of stone were collected, shaped, and arranged into architectural compounds. Walls defined spaces. Entrances controlled movement. Some settlements contained numerous interconnected structures, while others appear smaller and more dispersed. Why build so extensively in stone? One explanation is practical. Stone provided durable walls in an environment where wood and other building materials could be less reliable. A well-constructed compound could protect inhabitants from wind, animals, and perhaps human threats. Storage facilities could safeguard food supplies, while enclosed areas could help manage livestock. But the architecture seems to have served more than one purpose. The settlements were organized. Different spaces appear to have had different functions. Some areas were domestic, others associated with storage, animal management, or communal activity. This suggests that the people of Dhar Tichitt understood their settlements as structured environments rather than loose collections of shelters. That organization raises a deeper question. Who decided where the walls should go? The answer may not involve a single ruler. Complex architecture can emerge through collective decision-making, family networks, local leadership, or repeated traditions. The construction itself may have reinforced social cooperation. A household could build a wall. A community could build an entire settlement. And when the same architectural principles appeared repeatedly across different locations, they may have reflected shared cultural ideas. The stone structures therefore provide evidence not only of engineering, but of social identity. Perhaps a particular compound represented a family. Perhaps clusters of buildings corresponded to extended kin groups. Perhaps certain spaces belong to individuals with greater influence or specialized roles. Archaeologists have observed differences in the size and arrangement of structures, but interpreting those differences remains difficult. A larger building does not necessarily belong to a ruler. A more elaborate enclosure may reflect a different function rather than higher status. And a central structure could have been communal rather than political. This caution matters because Dhar Tichitt has sometimes been described as evidence of an early urban society. There is a reason for that interpretation. The settlements could be substantial, carefully organized, and occupied for extended periods. They show agriculture, livestock management, storage, craft production, and coordinated construction. But they do not resemble later cities in every respect. There is no clear evidence for centralized monarchy, writing, monumental temples, or bureaucratic administration. Perhaps Dhar Tichitt represents a different path toward complexity. A society can become organized without becoming a state. It can develop permanent settlements without kings. It can coordinate labor without constructing palaces. That possibility makes these sites especially significant. They demonstrate that complex social organization in West Africa had its own trajectory, shaped by local environments and traditions. Yet, the landscape around Dhar, Tichitt, eventually changed. Rainfall declined. Water became less dependable. Grasslands contracted. Agriculture became increasingly difficult. The same environment that had supported settled communities gradually became more arid. This climatic transition is one of the central elements in understanding the archaeological record. But climate alone may not explain everything. A drying landscape can create pressure without dictating exactly how people respond. Some communities may migrate. Others may change their economy. Some may become more dependent on livestock. Others may disperse into smaller settlements. The archaeological record suggests that communities associated with the Tichitt tradition eventually shifted toward other regions as environmental conditions changed. Yet, the process may have been gradual. There may have been years of declining rainfall followed by recovery. Periods of abundance may have alternated with drought. Communities could have adapted repeatedly before finally reaching a point where permanent settlement became difficult. This possibility makes the stone structures particularly evocative. They were built for a landscape that no longer exists. The walls are evidence of an environment that could support substantial communities, not simply isolated pastoral camps. The ruins, therefore, preserve a kind of environmental memory. They tell us that the Sahara was once capable of sustaining ways of life that would seem difficult to reconcile with the modern landscape. And perhaps the most compelling question is what happened inside these settlements during periods of stress. Did communities cooperate more closely? Did competition for water and fertile land intensify? Did livestock become more important as agriculture declined? Did some settlements absorb migrants from other areas? Or did social tensions eventually contribute to the abandonment of particular sites? The archaeological evidence does not provide a simple narrative. There are no surviving chronicles describing a final drought or a decisive conflict. Instead, archaeologists must reconstruct change from architecture, pottery, plant remains, animal bones, soil layers, and settlement patterns. Even the absence of evidence can be difficult to interpret. An abandoned building might indicate migration. It might indicate environmental pressure. It might simply reflect the normal movement of a community to a more favorable location. More speculative interpretations sometimes portray Dhar Tichitt as part of an early network of powerful settlements controlling resources and trade across the Western Sahara. There may indeed have been long-distance connections between communities, and the organization of agricultural production and livestock would have given certain settlements regional importance. But the evidence does not justify transforming every large compound into the residence of a chief or every stone wall into a defensive fortress. The reality may have been subtler. Authority could have been distributed. Communities could have negotiated access to land and water. Social status may have existed without becoming formal kingship. And ritual life could have existed alongside ordinary household activity without requiring monumental temples. This possibility helps explain why the settlements are so difficult to classify. They occupy a space between categories. They were more permanent than simple mobile camps, yet not clearly cities. They were socially organized, yet their political structure remains uncertain. They invested heavily in architecture, yet their monuments were primarily domestic and communal. Their world was complex, without leaving behind the institutional signatures archaeologists often associate with civilization. Perhaps that is precisely why Dhar Tichitt matters. It reminds us that human societies do not follow a single path. People can create substantial communities without writing. They can organize collective labor without kings. They can transform landscapes without building monumental palaces. and they can leave behind architecture capable of surviving thousands of years, even when almost everything else about their society has disappeared. The stones of Dhar Tichitt are therefore more than ruins. They are fragments of a vanished environmental setting and evidence of a community that adapted creatively to a changing world. Some structures may have sheltered families. Others may have stored grain. Some spaces may have been used for animals, craft production, or communal gatherings. And perhaps certain areas carried meanings that were never expressed materially enough for archaeologists to recognize them. The people who built these settlements understood their landscape intimately. They knew where water appeared after seasonal rains. They knew which soils could support crops. They knew where animals could graze. They understood how to construct durable walls from the stone around them. From the stone settlements of Dhar Tichitt, our journey moves farther south, into southeastern Nigeria, where the soil around Igbo-Ukwu has preserved an extraordinary record of ritual, craftsmanship, and social complexity. Here, beneath ordinary-looking ground, archaeologists encountered deposits containing objects whose technical sophistication and unusual arrangement opened an unexpected window onto West Africa more than 1,000 years ago. Igbo-Ukwu is associated with a series of archaeological finds discovered in the 20th century, most famously at 3 locations known as Igbo Richard, Igbo Isaiah, and Igbo Jonah. Excavations revealed burials and deposits containing hundreds of objects, including elaborately cast copper alloy vessels, beads, ornaments, ceramics, iron objects, and other materials. Radiocarbon evidence places the principal archaeological contexts around the 9th and 10th centuries AD. The discoveries were remarkable not simply because of their quantity, but because of their craftsmanship. Some of the copper alloy objects display extraordinarily intricate forms. Delicate openwork, raised patterns, spirals, twisted wires, and carefully modeled surfaces demonstrate a high level of technical control. Certain vessels contain representations of animals, insects, and geometric designs, while others possess forms that are difficult to compare directly with better-known traditions elsewhere in Africa. Yet, it is not only the objects themselves that create intrigue. It is where they were found. At Igbo Isaiah, archaeologists uncovered a large number of objects associated with a deep pit or ritual deposit. Among them were copper alloy objects, beads, pottery, iron implements, and other materials. Some artifacts appear to have been deliberately placed rather than simply discarded. That distinction is important. A discarded object tells us something about ordinary activity. A carefully arranged deposit may tell us something about belief, ceremony, authority, or memory. So, why were these objects placed together? The most conventional interpretation is that at least some of the deposits were associated with ritual activity. The unusual concentration of valuable objects suggests deliberate deposition rather than everyday refuse. Some objects may have been offerings, ceremonial equipment, or possessions connected with individuals of high status. But archaeology cannot always distinguish between a ritual deposit and a burial assemblage with complete certainty. The most famous Igbo-Ukwu discovery, Igbo Richard, contained a burial accompanied by an extraordinary collection of objects. The individual has often been interpreted as someone of elevated social position, perhaps a ruler, priest, or ritual specialist. Yet no inscription identifies the person. No surviving text tells us their title. No written account describes the ceremony. Instead, archaeologists are left with the physical arrangement of objects around the remains. Among the most remarkable finds were elaborate copper alloy vessels and ornaments, beads of glass and stone, ivory objects, iron artifacts, and other materials that suggest extensive networks of production and exchange. The sheer variety of materials raises another question. Where did all of these objects come from? Some of the glass beads and other materials appear to have originated outside the immediate region, indicating that Igbo-Ukwu was connected to wider exchange networks. Long-distance trade may have brought exotic materials into the community, where they could acquire new meanings and become incorporated into local ritual traditions. This does not necessarily mean that Igbo-Ukwu was directly connected to one distant civilization. Trade networks can involve many intermediaries. An object may travel hundreds or thousands of kilometers through a chain of exchanges without its original maker ever encountering the person who ultimately owned it. Igbo-Ukwu therefore provides evidence for a connected West African world long before European colonial expansion. But the most striking evidence concerns metallurgy. The copper alloy objects were made using sophisticated casting techniques, including lost wax casting. This process allows a craftsman to create intricate forms by shaping a wax model, covering it with a mold, removing the wax through heating, and then pouring molten metal into the resulting cavity. The technique requires considerable skill. Temperature must be controlled. Molds must be prepared correctly. Metal composition matters. Fine details can be lost if the casting fails. At Igbo-Ukwu, the results are remarkably refined. Some objects contain extraordinarily thin sections and intricate decorative elements that demonstrate careful craftsmanship. For archaeologists, this raises an important historical issue. How did such a specialized metalworking tradition develop in the region? One possibility is gradual local development. Craftspeople may have accumulated knowledge over generations, experimenting with copper alloys and refining casting methods until they achieved highly sophisticated results. Another possibility involves contact with external metalworking traditions. Long-distance exchange could have introduced materials, ideas, techniques, or specialist knowledge. But there is no need to assume that the entire technology was imported. Technology can spread without replacing local creativity. A community may encounter a foreign technique and transform it according to its own artistic traditions. The objects of Igbo-Ukwu appear strongly distinctive, suggesting that local craftspeople were not simply reproducing foreign designs. They were creating something of their own. This becomes even more interesting when the ritual deposits are considered. If certain objects were created specifically for ceremonial purposes, their value may not have depended simply on the amount of metal they contained. The process of making them could itself have carried meaning. A highly skilled craftsperson might have possessed specialized social status. Metalworking could have been associated with particular families, ritual specialists, or institutions. The finished object could then become part of a ceremonial system extending beyond ordinary economic life. Perhaps some vessels were used during rituals before being deliberately deposited. Perhaps certain ornaments represented rank or spiritual authority. Perhaps the objects were offerings intended to accompany a deceased individual. Or perhaps they were placed underground as part of ceremonies whose meanings have almost completely disappeared. There are also more speculative interpretations. Some have suggested that the complexity of Igbo-Ukwu metallurgy indicates a highly centralized political system comparable to later African kingdoms. That possibility cannot be completely excluded, but the archaeological evidence does not require it. Sophisticated craftsmanship does not automatically prove centralized government. Highly skilled specialists can operate within societies organized through kinship, religious institutions, elite households, or decentralized networks. Igbo-Ukwu may therefore represent a form of social complexity that does not fit neatly into familiar categories. The absence of monumental architecture is particularly interesting. There are no giant pyramids dominating the landscape. No enormous stone temples announce the presence of a ruling dynasty. Instead, power and identity may have been expressed through objects. A beautifully cast vessel can be transported. an ornament can be worn, a ritual object can be displayed during ceremonies, and eventually, such objects can be buried. In that sense, the deposits themselves may have been monuments. Not monuments built upward, but downward. Objects were removed from circulation and placed into the earth, perhaps permanently. That act could have carried powerful meaning. An object of great value becomes more significant when it is deliberately surrendered. It can symbolize devotion, transition, sacrifice, remembrance, or the transfer of wealth from the living to the dead. But which of these meanings applied at Igbo-Ukwu? The evidence does not provide a definitive answer. The burial at Igbo Richard is particularly difficult to interpret because the identity and social role of the individual remain uncertain. The abundance of objects suggests importance, but importance can take many forms. A ruler may possess wealth. A priest may possess ritual objects. A specialist may be buried with tools associated with sacred knowledge. A revered ancestor may receive an elaborate ceremony regardless of political authority. Without written records, these possibilities remain open. The deposits also remind us that archaeological discoveries are shaped by what survives. Organic materials may have decayed. Wood, textiles, food offerings, plants, and other elements of the ceremonies may have disappeared almost entirely. What remains are the materials capable of surviving underground: metal, stone, glass, ceramic, and human bone. The surviving objects may therefore represent only a fraction of what once occupied these ritual spaces. Perhaps the most important elements of the ceremonies were made from materials that left almost no trace. This creates a peculiar imbalance. We can study the metal in extraordinary detail. We can reconstruct casting techniques. We can identify chemical compositions. We can examine wear and manufacturing marks. But the beliefs that gave those objects meaning remain largely inaccessible. And that gap is where the deeper mystery of Igbo-Ukwu resides. The site demonstrates that communities in West Africa during the first millennium AD possessed sophisticated metallurgical knowledge, participated in long-distance exchange, and created complex ritual assemblages. From the ritual deposits of Igbo-Ukwu, our journey now moves deep into the tropical forests of northern Borneo, toward a landscape where limestone cliffs rise above dense vegetation and enormous caves open into the darkness. In the Niah region of Sarawak, these chambers preserve traces of human activity extending across tens of thousands of years. And among the most evocative discoveries are the remains of the dead, placed within spaces that may have carried meanings far beyond ordinary burial. The Niah Caves form part of a vast limestone landscape in northwestern Borneo. The largest chamber, known as the Great Cave, is immense, with a broad entrance allowing sunlight and humid forest air to penetrate deep into the rock. For generations, people used these caves as places of shelter, habitation, work, and eventually burial. The archaeological record is extraordinary. Evidence from Niah demonstrates human occupation reaching back roughly 40,000 years, making the site one of the most important records of early human presence in Southeast Asia. Charcoal, stone tools, animal remains, shell, hearths, and human remains reveal repeated episodes of occupation across immense spans of time. But the caves were not simply places where people lived. They also became places where the dead were treated in distinctive ways. Within the wider Niah complex, archaeologists have identified numerous burials dating to different periods. Some were placed in pits, while others were associated with distinctive funerary practices that reflect changing ideas about death and the body. One of the most remarkable discoveries came from the Painted Cave, where human remains and ancient burial evidence occur alongside enigmatic rock art. The walls contain red and dark painted motifs, including human figures and geometric forms. Some of the imagery appears to have been associated with the mortuary use of the cave. Here, the boundary between burial place and symbolic landscape becomes difficult to separate. Why would people bring their dead into a cavern already filled with images? Were the paintings created specifically for funerary ceremonies? Or did the cave already possess significance before it became a place for the dead? The archaeological evidence cannot provide a simple answer. The painted cave belongs to a later period than the earliest human occupation at Niah. Its mortuary evidence is associated particularly with the Neolithic and later periods, when communities in the region were developing new technologies, exchange networks, and increasingly elaborate relationships with the dead. Among the most intriguing discoveries are boat-shaped coffins. These vessels, sometimes described as boat coffins, represent one of the most distinctive funerary traditions associated with Niah and parts of island Southeast Asia. Rather than placing a body directly into the earth, communities constructed or used wooden containers whose form evokes a boat. The symbolism is difficult to miss. A boat carries someone from one place to another. Could the coffin have represented a journey? That interpretation has often been proposed in connection with boat burials across Southeast Asia, where boats can carry profound symbolic associations with travel, transformation, and the passage between realms. But symbolism must be approached carefully. A boat-shaped coffin does not automatically prove a belief in a voyage to an afterlife. The shape could have reflected practical traditions, cultural identity, or an established funerary convention whose original meaning had changed over time. The people who created these coffins left no written explanation. All that remains is wood, soil, bone, pigment, and the architecture of the cave. And wood rarely survives for thousands of years in tropical environments unless unusually favorable conditions preserve it. That makes every surviving fragment especially valuable. The cave itself may have helped protect what would otherwise have disappeared. Deep inside limestone chambers, temperature, humidity, sediment, and limited disturbance can create conditions capable of preserving materials that would quickly decay in the open landscape. This creates an unusual archaeological situation. The cave is not simply a shelter, it is a time capsule. Layers accumulated above earlier surfaces, sealing traces of human activity beneath later deposits. A hearth could disappear beneath sediment. A burial could remain undisturbed for centuries. A fragment of charcoal could preserve evidence of a fire created by people whose names were never recorded. And beneath the darkness, different generations repeatedly entered the same landscape. That continuity raises an important question. Did later communities understand the caves as places connected with their predecessors? There is no certain answer, but repeated use suggests that particular locations retained importance. The Great Cave and Painted Cave were not anonymous spaces. Their distinctive geography would have been difficult to overlook. The enormous limestone entrance, the surrounding cliffs, and the deep interior chambers created a landscape unlike ordinary habitation areas. Such places can become culturally significant simply through repeated association. A community may return because its ancestors were buried there. Another generation may return because ceremonies have always been performed there. Eventually, the physical place itself becomes part of collective memory. The dead remain within the landscape. The living return to them. And the cave becomes a bridge between generations. Some burials at Niah also demonstrate that mortuary customs were not static. Different periods produced different treatments of human remains. Some individuals were buried in particular positions or containers, while other remains appear to have been disturbed, relocated, or incorporated into later activity. Such practices complicate the idea that burial was simply a final disposal of the body. In many societies, death is not a single event. It can involve several stages. A body may first be placed somewhere temporarily. Later, remains may be collected, moved, or buried again. Ceremonies may occur at different moments. The physical treatment of the dead can therefore reflect an extended process through which a person gradually changes from a living member of the community into an ancestor. Could something similar have occurred at Niah? Perhaps. The evidence is compatible with complex mortuary traditions, but it cannot reconstruct every ceremony. There is another intriguing feature of the painted cave. The presence of human figures and other painted imagery alongside mortuary remains creates the possibility that the cave walls formed part of the ritual environment. The paintings may have represented people, spirits, ancestors, or symbolic concepts. Yet their exact meaning remains uncertain. Some figures are relatively simple. Others appear more elaborate. Their relationship to the burials is compelling, but not completely understood. A modern viewer naturally wants to connect the images with the dead. The original artists may have made an entirely different distinction. Perhaps the paintings depicted individuals who had already died. Perhaps they represented participants in ceremonies. Perhaps they belonged to stories or traditions unrelated to specific burials. Without a written record, interpretation remains cautious. More speculative theories sometimes suggest that the caves were viewed as entrances into another realm, with the darkness and subterranean chambers representing a transition from ordinary life to an ancestral world. There is no direct evidence proving such a belief, but the physical setting would certainly have provided powerful imagery. A person could enter the bright tropical landscape outside and gradually disappear into darkness. The familiar world would give way to narrow passages, towering limestone walls, echoes, and absolute darkness. For a prehistoric community, such a place could easily acquire symbolic significance. Yet, the significance may have developed gradually rather than being deliberately designed from the beginning. Perhaps the cave became sacred because generations repeatedly used it for important ceremonies. Perhaps the dead themselves made the place significant. Perhaps the paintings and burials formed parts of a single cultural tradition. Or perhaps several unrelated practices accumulated within the same remarkable landscape over thousands of years. This last possibility is particularly important. Niah was used for an extraordinarily long period. Different populations occupied the region. Different technologies appeared. Environmental conditions changed. Languages and cultural traditions may have shifted. The meaning of the cave could therefore have changed repeatedly. A place that served primarily as shelter during one period might become a burial ground much later. A painted wall could acquire new interpretations. An older burial could become an ancestral landmark for people who never knew the individual originally placed there. The cave could accumulate memory, and that may be one of the deepest mysteries preserved at Niah. Not a single unexplained artifact, but the persistence of human attention. Generation after generation returned to the same limestone landscape. They cooked food there. They made tools. They processed resources. They buried their dead. They painted images onto stone. They left objects behind. Then other people came after them and added their own traces. Thousands of years later, archaeologists can still see fragments of this sequence, but the voices are gone. From the limestone darkness of Niah, our journey now moves eastward across the Pacific, toward the volcanic islands of Vanuatu, where the remains of one of the earliest known settlements in the Southwest Pacific preserve an extraordinary record of migration, identity, and death. Near the coast of Efate lies Teuma, a site whose surrounding landscape is green and tropical today. But beneath the soil, archaeologists uncovered something far more revealing than ordinary settlement debris. A cemetery containing dozens of individuals associated with the early Lapita tradition. The discovery transformed our understanding of the people who first established permanent communities across this part of Oceania. The Lapita culture emerged roughly 3,000 years ago, spreading across a vast region of the Western Pacific. Its characteristic decorated pottery, distinctive tools, ornaments, and settlement patterns provide some of the clearest archaeological evidence for the movement of people into islands that had never before supported permanent human populations. Teuma belongs to this extraordinary period of expansion. But the cemetery presents a more intimate story. More than 90 individuals were identified within the burial area, making Teuma one of the most important early Pacific cemeteries ever excavated. The graves contained men, women, and children. Some were buried individually. Others were disturbed or rearranged after burial. And in several cases, skulls were removed or repositioned. That detail immediately raises questions. Why would a community return to graves after the bodies had been buried? One explanation lies in secondary burial practices. Across many societies, death can involve more than one ceremony. A body may initially be placed in the ground, followed later by the collection or movement of selected bones. The skull can receive special treatment because it preserves the face and therefore the identity of the deceased. At Teuma, the archaeological evidence is consistent with complex mortuary practices in which burial was not necessarily the final stage. Perhaps the dead remained socially important after death. Perhaps particular bones represented continuing relationships between ancestors and descendants. Or perhaps the cemetery was periodically reorganized as the community expanded and new burials were added. The site itself was not simply a place of individual graves. It appears to have been a shared burial ground associated with an early community adapting to an unfamiliar island environment. That context matters. The people buried at Teuma were part of one of the great movements of human settlement. Their ancestors had traveled across enormous distances through the Pacific, using maritime knowledge that allowed them to navigate between islands separated by open ocean. They carried plants, animals, tools, pottery traditions, and social customs with them. But when they arrived in places such as Vanuatu, they encountered landscapes with different resources and ecological conditions. The cemetery may therefore represent more than death. It may preserve the earliest generations of a population establishing itself in a new world. Scientific analysis has provided additional clues. Researchers have studied the skeletons using archaeology, radiocarbon dating, isotopic analysis, and ancient DNA. These methods have helped reconstruct aspects of diet, mobility, ancestry, and population relationships. The results suggest that the people buried at Teuma were closely connected with the early Lapita expansion. Some individuals appear to have originated from populations linked to regions farther west, while later Pacific populations developed through complex mixtures of ancestry and local interaction. The cemetery therefore captures a moment of transition. A community had crossed the ocean. Now it was becoming part of the island. Yet the burial practices themselves may reveal how these newcomers understood belonging. A cemetery establishes a relationship with place. Once ancestors are buried in a particular landscape, that landscape can become more than a temporary settlement. It becomes a place where generations are connected. This is especially significant for communities whose recent ancestors had traveled extensively. The first settlers of an island had no generations of ancestors buried there. Teuma may represent the beginning of that relationship. The dead became physically connected to the new homeland. Their graves marked a claim of continuity. The island was no longer simply somewhere the living had reached. It became a place where their dead would remain. But the cemetery also contains evidence that burial customs were changing. Some graves were reopened. Some remains were disturbed. Certain skulls appear to have been separated from the rest of the skeleton. This could reflect ancestor-related practices, ritual transformation, or practical rearrangement as later burials were introduced. there is no single interpretation that explains every case. More speculative theories have suggested that skull removal may have represented a deliberate separation between the physical body and the identity of the deceased. The skull could have been retained as a form of ancestral representation. Such practices are known ethnographically in various parts of Oceania and elsewhere, but connecting later traditions directly to Teuma requires caution. The archaeological evidence can demonstrate what happened to the remains. It cannot tell us exactly what people believed those actions accomplished. And then there is the question of identity. Why were some people buried with particular objects while others were not? Were grave goods expressions of personal status? Did they represent gender, age, occupation, or family identity? Or were they simply objects available to the community at the time of burial? Lapida pottery provides another layer of complexity. The distinctive ceramics found across the Pacific are often treated as markers of cultural identity. Their geometric designs demonstrate shared traditions across enormous distances. But cultural similarity does not necessarily mean every community was organized in the same way. Teuma's inhabitants may have shared pottery styles while developing local customs of their own. The cemetery could therefore reveal how a broader cultural tradition was transformed in a new environment. This is where the site becomes particularly significant. The Lapita expansion was not simply a movement of artifacts. People traveled. Families traveled. Children were born during the voyages. New communities formed. Old traditions were adapted. And eventually, people died far from the lands where their ancestors had lived. At Teuma, those lives became part of the archaeological record. The remains also offer evidence of hardship. Early settlers entering unfamiliar islands faced challenges involving food, disease, climate, and adaptation. Some individuals may have experienced nutritional stress or other difficulties associated with establishing a new community. Yet, the cemetery should not be viewed simply as evidence of failure. Its very existence demonstrates persistence. People remained. They established homes. They cultivated plants. They raised animals. They created social relationships. And they buried their dead. The cemetery may have been one of the earliest physical statements that the community intended to remain connected to this place. Still, many details remain uncertain. We do not know whether the cemetery served one settlement or a broader network of communities. We do not know whether all individuals belonged to the same social group. We do not know exactly why certain graves were reopened, and we cannot reconstruct the ceremonies that accompanied burial. The bones tell us that something happened. The soil preserves where it happened. The artifacts provide clues about how people lived. But the emotional and spiritual dimensions remain largely inaccessible. Perhaps that is the enduring significance of Teuma. It captures a moment when people crossed one of the largest natural barriers on Earth and established themselves on distant islands. Then, generations later, their descendants would inherit a landscape already marked by the graves of those who came before them. The cemetery became a physical memory of migration, a reminder that the people who arrived by canoe were not merely explorers passing through. They were building lives. They were creating communities, and they were becoming part of a new world. Yet, the altered graves and separated remains leave one question suspended over the site. When the people of Teuma returned to the graves of their dead, were they simply following a practical funerary tradition? Or were they preserving a relationship with ancestors whose presence helped transform a newly settled island into a permanent home? From the ocean crossings preserved at Teuma, our journey now moves to an entirely different environment, deep into the lowlands of Bolivia, where the landscape itself appears to have been reshaped on a remarkable scale. Across the Llanos de Mojos, broad grasslands stretch between seasonal wetlands, forests, rivers, and shallow lakes. From the ground, much of this terrain can look natural. From above, another story begins to emerge. Long, raised embankments cross the plains. Straight channels cut through wetlands. Elevated causeways connect areas that would otherwise become isolated during seasonal flooding. And scattered across the landscape are mounds, reservoirs, forest islands, and geometric earthworks. For decades, many of these features were difficult to recognize as archaeological remains. Dense vegetation and the immense scale of the region concealed their patterns. But aerial photography, satellite imagery, and archaeological surveys gradually revealed that large portions of the Llanos de Mojos had been carefully modified by human communities. The question is not whether people changed this landscape. They clearly did. The deeper question is how they understood and managed an environment that could shift dramatically between waterlogged floodplain and dry grassland. The Llanos de Mojos receive strong seasonal rainfall. During the wet season, large areas can become flooded, while the dry season transforms the same landscape into open grassland. For communities living here centuries ago, water was both essential and dangerous. Too little could threaten crops. Too much could destroy them. The archaeological response appears to have included an impressive system of landscape engineering. Raised fields could elevate crops above seasonal flooding. Canals may have helped move water through the landscape, while causeways provided routes across wetlands. Artificial mounds offered elevated locations for settlement, and some may have supported groves of useful plants. None of these features necessarily represents a single centralized project. Instead, they may reflect generations of local experimentation. A community could build a raised field. Later generations could expand it. Another settlement might construct a causeway toward a neighboring area. Over centuries, individual modifications could become part of an enormous engineered landscape. This possibility changes how we view the ancient inhabitants of the region. For a long time, tropical South America was sometimes portrayed as a place where large-scale agriculture and complex societies were limited by dense forests and poor soils. The Llanos de Mojos challenges that assumption. The environment was difficult, but it was not necessarily unproductive. With sufficient knowledge, people could manipulate water, soils, vegetation, and elevation to create a landscape capable of supporting substantial populations. Some researchers have proposed that the earthworks indicate relatively large and socially organized communities. There is evidence for settlements associated with mounds and raised areas, along with ceramics and other archaeological materials. But the exact political organization remains uncertain. Did a central authority coordinate construction across enormous distances? Or did numerous communities independently develop similar strategies? The second possibility may be more consistent with the gradual development visible in parts of the archaeological record. Complex landscapes do not always require a single ruler. They can emerge through cooperation, tradition, and repeated adaptation. Yet, some of the earthworks are so extensive that they invite comparison with engineered landscapes elsewhere in the ancient world. Long causeways can extend for considerable distances. Straight channels cross terrain that would otherwise be difficult to navigate. Artificial platforms rise above surrounding floodplains. Their geometry suggests planning. But planning does not necessarily mean centralized government. A community with detailed knowledge of its environment can construct remarkably precise systems without creating a bureaucratic state. Perhaps the most fascinating feature is the way the earthworks interact with the natural landscape. Rather than attempting to eliminate wetlands, the builders appear to have worked with them. Water was redirected. Elevated land was created. Agricultural areas were raised. Travel routes were constructed across seasonal obstacles. The landscape was not conquered. It was negotiated. That relationship becomes particularly important when considering climate. The ancient inhabitants of the Llanos de Mojos lived in an environment where seasonal cycles were fundamental. Their survival depended on anticipating water levels, rainfall, soil conditions, and the behavior of plants and animals. The earthworks may therefore represent accumulated environmental knowledge. A raised field is not merely an agricultural structure. It can be a response to flooding. A canal is not simply a ditch. It can reflect an understanding of water movement. A causeway is not only a road. It can preserve mobility when surrounding ground becomes saturated. Taken together, these features suggest a sophisticated understanding of seasonal change. But there is another possibility. Some earthworks may have had social or ceremonial functions in addition to practical ones. Large mounds could have served as gathering places. Elevated platforms may have carried structures whose purpose has not survived archaeologically. Geometric arrangements could have reflected social boundaries or ritual concepts. Such interpretations remain tentative. An earthwork can have multiple functions. A raised platform might support houses during floods, while simultaneously becoming a symbol of community identity. A causeway might facilitate transportation, while also connecting socially important places. Practical and ceremonial purposes do not necessarily exclude one another. More speculative interpretations have occasionally suggested that the Llanos de Mojos earthworks represent an enormous, centrally planned civilization, comparable to the largest urban societies of the ancient world. The evidence does not establish such a conclusion. What it does demonstrate is already significant. People living in the region transformed vast areas of difficult terrain. They developed systems for managing water and agriculture. They constructed permanent or semi-permanent settlements. And they left an archaeological footprint far larger than earlier generations of researchers had recognized. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect is that much of this landscape remained almost invisible from ground level. A person walking across one raised field might see little more than a low ridge. A channel could appear to be a natural depression. A mound might look like an ordinary rise in the terrain. Only when these features are viewed together does their scale become apparent. Modern remote sensing has therefore changed the investigation. Technology has not created the earthworks. It has simply allowed us to see relationships that were already there. And those relationships raise questions about population. How many people lived across these engineered landscapes? Were settlements occupied continuously? Did communities move seasonally? How much labor was required to maintain the fields and canals? And how did these systems respond when environmental conditions changed? The answers remain incomplete. Some areas were eventually abandoned. Vegetation reclaimed parts of the engineered landscape. Flooding and erosion altered others. Later communities built upon earlier modifications or used the same elevated locations. The archaeological record therefore contains several layers of human interaction with the same environment. This makes the Llanos de Mojos difficult to interpret as a single civilization with a single moment of achievement. It was more likely a long process. Generations of people observed the behavior of water. They tested crops. They built fields. They modified channels. They learned which places remained dry and which became submerged. And gradually they transformed the floodplain into a landscape capable of supporting human settlement on a larger scale. The earthworks may therefore tell us something fundamental about the relationship between humans and difficult environments. People do not always need to escape challenging landscapes. Sometimes they learn to reshape them. But how much of this transformation was intentional from the beginning? How much emerged gradually through generations of experimentation? And did the people who built the earliest earthworks understand that their work would eventually form part of a vast, interconnected landscape? Today, many of their structures are difficult to see from the ground. The grass grows over ancient ridges. Trees occupy old, elevated areas. Seasonal water fills channels that may have been shaped by human hands centuries ago. Yet the pattern remains. Across the Llanos de Mojos, the earth still carries the imprint of communities that understood flooding not simply as a threat, but as a force that could be managed. And as more of this landscape comes into view, one question remains open. How far did the people of the Llanos de Mojos deliberately reshape their world? And how much of the vast pattern visible today represents a system whose full purpose has yet to be understood? From the immense earthworks of the Llanos de Mojos, our journey moves farther south, toward the Atlantic coast of Brazil, where another landscape reveals a very different form of human construction. Here, along the wetlands and lagoons of Santa Catarina, low hills rise from otherwise level terrain. At first glance, they may resemble natural ridges, but closer inspection reveals layers of shells, soil, fire remains, tools, and human burials accumulated over generations. One of the most important sites in this landscape is Jaboticabera II, a large shell-mound, or sambaqui, built by coastal communities thousands of years ago. The word shell-mound can sound deceptively simple. It suggests a heap of discarded food. But Jaboticabera II is far more complex. The mound was constructed gradually, using enormous quantities of shells mixed with sediment and other materials. Within its layers are traces of habitation, activity areas, and numerous human burials. The result is not merely a refuse pile, it is a constructed landscape. For the people who created it, the accumulation of shells appears to have been part of a long-term relationship with the coast. Estuaries, lagoons, and shallow waters provided fish, shellfish, and other resources. The mound grew as generations returned to the same location. But why build such enormous structures from the remains of meals? One explanation is practical. Shells were abundant, durable, and readily available. Repeated disposal in one location could naturally create a raised mound. Yet, the scale and organization of sites such as Jaboticabera II suggest that something more deliberate was taking place. The mound became a place where people lived, worked, gathered, and buried their dead. That combination is important. In many archaeological contexts, burial grounds are separated from ordinary domestic spaces. At Jaboticabera II, however, the boundaries appear less clear. The living and the dead occupied the same constructed landscape. Burials were placed within the mound, sometimes in carefully prepared contexts. Bodies were positioned according to practices that may have reflected age, status, identity, or community tradition. And as new layers accumulated, earlier graves became incorporated into the structure itself. The mound, therefore, became a kind of archive. Each generation added another layer. Each burial became part of the physical landscape. Each meal, fire, tool, and ceremony contributed to the growing structure. Over centuries, the mound preserved fragments of daily life alongside evidence of death. This creates an unusual archaeological problem. How do we distinguish ordinary activity from ritual? A shell may have been discarded after a meal. Another shell may have been intentionally placed near a burial. A fire could have been used for cooking, or it could have formed part of a ceremony. The material itself does not always reveal its purpose. Context becomes essential. At Jaboticabera II, researchers have found evidence suggesting that some areas of the mound were deliberately organized around funerary activities. Certain burials appear to have been accompanied by objects or associated with particular arrangements of sediment and shell. Such patterns suggest that death was not treated as a simple act of disposal. The deceased were incorporated into a meaningful place. But what did that place represent? Perhaps the mound was a cemetery. Perhaps it was simultaneously a settlement, ceremonial center, and ancestral landmark. Perhaps its significance changed over time. These possibilities are not mutually exclusive. A location can begin as a place of repeated habitation and gradually become a place associated with ancestors. Once generations have been buried there, the mound acquires a history of its own. The physical presence of the dead could reinforce attachment to the location. For coastal communities whose lives depended heavily on particular lagoons and waterways, such continuity may have been especially important. The mound could connect people to both landscape and ancestry. There is also evidence that these communities possess detailed knowledge of their environment. The abundance of marine remains reflects extensive use of coastal resources. Fish, shellfish, and other foods formed an important part of the subsistence system. But the people who built Jabuticabera II were not simply exploiting nature. They were selecting a particular location and returning to it repeatedly. The mound itself became a product of that relationship. Some interpretations have emphasized the possibility that Shell-Mounds served as territorial markers, signaling long-term attachment to particular coastal zones. Others have focused on their funerary significance. Still others emphasize everyday life and communal activity. Perhaps the most convincing interpretation allows all three possibilities to coexist. A shell mound can be a home, it can be a cemetery, and it can become a monument. The distinction depends on how the community used it. Jabuticabera II is particularly valuable because the archaeological record preserves this complexity. Human remains occur alongside the debris of daily existence. That combination allows researchers to study not only how people died, but how they lived. Yet, the burials introduce another layer of uncertainty. Were particular individuals treated differently because of social status? Did age or gender influence burial practices? Were some people more closely associated with ritual roles? The archaeological evidence provides clues, but it does not offer a complete social hierarchy. It is tempting to interpret elaborate burials as evidence of powerful individuals. But status can be expressed in many ways. A person might be important because of family connections, ritual knowledge, age, skill, or ancestral identity rather than political authority. More speculative interpretations sometimes portray large sambakis as centers controlled by hereditary elites. There may have been social distinctions within these communities, but the evidence does not require the existence of kings or centralized rulers. Large-scale construction can emerge through communal labor. The mound itself may have been created not by command, but by repeated participation. People contributed shells, families returned, burials accumulated, ceremonies were performed, and over generations the collective result became enormous. This possibility makes the site especially intriguing. The monument may not represent the power of one individual. It may represent the memory of an entire community. The dead were not removed from the landscape. They became part of it. The mound rose gradually above the surrounding wetlands, carrying within its layers the physical remains of people who had lived along the coast for centuries. Perhaps its height was never the primary goal. Perhaps what mattered was accumulation itself. Each new layer added another connection to those who had come before. There is also a deeper question about how the mound was perceived. Did people see it as a single monument, or did they experience it as a familiar landscape of graves, gathering places, and working areas? A modern observer sees a large archaeological structure. The people who created it may have experienced something completely different. They would have known where particular ancestors were buried. They would have remembered where ceremonies took place. They may have associated specific sections with particular families or events. That knowledge disappeared with time. Only the physical structure remains. Today, Jabuticabera II stands as evidence of a society that invested extraordinary effort in a coastal landscape. The shells reveal what people ate. The tools reveal aspects of their technology. The sediment preserves traces of activity. The burials provide evidence of how they treated their dead. But none of these materials can fully reconstruct the beliefs that connected them. Were the shells simply building material? Were they offerings? Did their accumulation have symbolic meaning? Did the mound serve as a physical connection between ancestors, community, and landscape? The evidence allows several possibilities. And perhaps the most compelling mystery is not why these people used shells, but why they continued returning to the same place for generations, building upward while placing their dead within the growing structure. Long after the voices of those communities disappeared, the mound remained. Its layers still contain fragments of meals, fires, tools, ceremonies, and human lives. And somewhere within that accumulation may lie the meaning of Jabuticabera II, a meaning that the shells have preserved, but that time has left us unable to hear. From the shell mounds of Brazil, our journey now turns toward the Pacific coast of Peru, where a very different kind of monument rises from the dry landscape of the Casma Valley. Here, among barren hills and irrigated fields, the remains of Sechin Bajo reveal layers of construction extending back thousands of years, far earlier than many of the monumental societies traditionally associated with the Andes. Today, the valley appears stark and sun-baked. Rain is scarce. Vegetation survives largely where water is deliberately brought into the landscape. Yet, beneath this dry surface lies evidence of communities capable of organizing labor on a remarkable scale. Sechin Bajo is not a single structure. It is a complex of platforms, plazas, circular features, walls, and successive architectural layers built and rebuilt over long periods. Some of its earliest construction dates to around 3500 BC, placing the site among the earliest monumental architectural complexes known in the Americas. That date alone changes the perspective. The people responsible for these structures lived thousands of years before the Inca Empire, before the great Andean states, and long before the better-known monumental centers that dominate popular images of ancient Peru. They had no metal tools comparable to those of later societies. Yet they moved enormous quantities of earth and stone. Why? The simplest explanation begins with community organization. Large platforms and plazas require coordinated labor. Even if individual tasks were relatively simple, the cumulative effort would have been immense. People had to quarry or collect stone, transport it, prepare foundations, construct walls, move earth, maintain surfaces, and repeat the process when buildings were remodeled. The architecture therefore provides evidence not only of engineering, but of social cooperation. Perhaps the most remarkable feature of Sechin Bajo is its layered history. Buildings were not simply constructed once and abandoned. Earlier structures were sometimes covered and replaced by later ones. New plazas appeared. Walls were modified. Platforms expanded. Architectural spaces changed function. The site became a record of generations repeatedly transforming the same sacred or communal landscape. This raises an intriguing possibility. Perhaps the builders regarded earlier architecture as meaningful even when they chose to cover it. Buried structures may have remained part of collective memory. A new building could stand directly above an older one, connecting the present community with something constructed centuries earlier. Such practices are known elsewhere in the Andes. But Sechin Bajo is particularly significant because some of its earliest phases belong to a period when monumental architecture in the Americas was still developing. The question is how such a tradition emerged. Were the earliest structures ceremonial? Were they gathering places? Did they serve administrative purposes? Or did they combine several functions? The large open plazas suggest spaces where groups of people could assemble. Their scale makes ordinary domestic use unlikely. A plaza can support ceremonies, communal gatherings, political events, markets, or combinations of these activities. But without written records, the precise nature of the gatherings remains uncertain. Archaeologists must reconstruct behavior from architecture. A circular feature may have had ritual significance. A platform may have supported an important building. A broad plaza may have provided space for communal events. But architecture does not explain itself. The people who use these spaces knew their meanings. We do not. One of the most intriguing aspects of Çayönü is its relationship with water and agriculture. The surrounding Kazma Valley could support agriculture through irrigation, allowing communities to cultivate crops despite the arid climate. This created a relationship between monumental construction and agricultural productivity. Food production could sustain larger communities. Larger communities could support specialized labor. Specialized labor could produce monumental architecture. And monumental spaces could reinforce social organization. This does not prove that Çayönü was governed by a centralized ruler. A more cautious interpretation is that the site demonstrates substantial collective organization. Leadership may have existed, but its exact form remains uncertain. Perhaps authority belonged to ritual specialists. Perhaps influential families coordinated labor. Perhaps communities came together periodically for major construction projects. The architecture cannot tell us which model is correct. More speculative interpretations sometimes describe Çayönü as evidence for one of the earliest urban or state-like societies in the Americas. There is some basis for viewing it as a center of considerable social complexity, but calling it a fully developed state would go beyond the evidence. The earliest communities of the Kazma Valley may have organized themselves in ways that do not fit neatly into later political categories. Their monuments were substantial, their labor systems were sophisticated, their settlements were permanent, yet their political structure remains largely invisible. That uncertainty makes the site more, rather than less, interesting. Çayönü reminds us that monumental architecture does not appear suddenly with kings and bureaucracies. It can emerge through gradual social developments. A community builds one platform. Another generation expands it. A ritual space becomes established. A gathering place becomes traditional. Eventually, the accumulated architecture becomes enormous. The monument is then the product of centuries rather than the vision of a single ruler. And beneath the later structures, earlier layers remain. Excavations at Çayönü have revealed architectural phases extending far into the 4th millennium BC. Some of the earliest constructions include circular or semicircular features and carefully prepared spaces that indicate organized activity long before the later monumental complex reached its full scale. What happened during those earliest ceremonies? We can only speculate. Perhaps people gathered for seasonal events. Perhaps rituals were connected with agricultural cycles. Perhaps the architecture served as a meeting place where different communities exchanged goods, information, and marriage partners. Or perhaps religious practices dominated the site. None of these explanations can yet account for everything. The mystery becomes even deeper when considering the broader development of the Andes. Around this period, communities in several parts of the region were becoming increasingly sedentary. Agriculture was expanding. Fishing and marine resources remained important along the coast. Settlements grew more permanent, and communal architecture began appearing in multiple regions. Çayönü belongs to this larger transformation. It was not an isolated experiment. It was part of a changing world in which people were developing new ways to organize themselves and their environments. Yet, its early date gives it a special significance. The monument predates many famous Andean centers by centuries. It shows that monumental construction had deep roots. The people who built Çayönü were not merely responding to a fully developed civilization around them. They were participating in the process through which complex societies were emerging. Perhaps that is the greatest mystery preserved by its foundations. How did ordinary communities reach the point where building on such a scale became possible? What social relationships made collective labor worthwhile? What beliefs convinced generations of people to return to the same place and rebuild? And what did those enormous plazas mean to the people standing inside them? Today, the answers are buried beneath layers of earth and stone. The dry valley has preserved the outlines of walls that once carried color, activity, and human voices. The people who constructed them left no written explanation. Only architecture remains: a platform, a plaza, a buried structure, a later building standing above an earlier one. Each layer represents a decision made by people whose world has otherwise disappeared. And perhaps the deepest question at Sechenbajo is not simply who built the monument, but why generations of people continued to transform the same place, covering earlier structures while preserving their presence beneath the ground. A tradition whose meaning may still lie waiting in the layers that have not yet been fully uncovered.